My parents worshipped my sister. When I happily announced my pregnancy at our formal family dinner, they did not offer tears of joy or warm congratulations. Instead, my own mother lunged across the mahogany table and struck my stomach, screaming that the first grandchild had to belong to her golden child. What she did not know was that her vicious act of violence was about to trigger a chain reaction that would completely destroy her carefully crafted life. I am Madeline, 30 years old, and my family just made the most devastating mistake of their miserable lives. Before I dive into the chaos that unfolded that night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to love you most. The air inside the dining room of my parents' sprawling Gold Coast penthouse in Chicago felt heavy and suffocating. It was a Friday evening and we were gathered for what was supposed to be a celebratory family dinner. The room was a monument to their obsession with wealth and status, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan and a massive dining table set with imported fine china. My mother, Catherine, and my father, William, sat at opposite ends playing the roles of prosperous asset managers, even though I knew their firm was quietly bleeding money. My younger sister Brittany sat directly across from me, sipping sparkling water and preening under our parents' constant adoration. Beside her sat her husband Jamal, a brilliant and highly principled man whose African-American family ran one of the most powerful medical investment syndicates in the entire city. My parents secretly harbored deep prejudices, but they clung to Jamal and his family wealth like desperate parasites. My husband Colin sat beside me, his warm hand resting steadily on my knee under the table. We had been waiting for the perfect moment to share our news. We had kept my pregnancy a fiercely guarded secret for 4 full months, wanting to ensure everything was safe and healthy before dealing with the inevitable family drama. Colin squeezed my hand, giving me the silent signal that it was finally time. I cleared my throat lightly, tapping my spoon against my crystal water glass. The quiet chime cut through my mother's rambling story about her latest country club luncheon. Everyone turned to look at me. Catherine raised a perfectly arched eyebrow, clearly annoyed by the sudden interruption. Colin and I have some very exciting news to share with you all, I said, keeping my voice bright and hopeful despite my nerves. We recently had our 16-week ultrasound. I am 4 months pregnant. We are having a baby. I had expected a forced smile, maybe a stiff congratulations, or at worst, a passive-aggressive comment about how I would balance a child with my demanding career. I did not expect the absolute terrifying silence that crashed over the dining room. It was not a surprise silence. It was a heavy, suffocating deadness. No one moved. No one spoke a single word. I watched the color drain completely out of my mother's face. Her eyes darted rapidly from me to Brittany. My sister dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate. Brittany looked absolutely stricken, her face contorting into a mask of pure panic. She stared at our mother, silently communicating a frantic, desperate message that I could not decipher. My father, William, gripped the edges of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white, his jaw clenching tightly, as if I had just announced a death instead of a new life. "Mom," I asked softly, my smile faltering. "Did you hear me? We are having a baby." The sudden explosion of violence happened so fast that my brain struggled to fully process it. Catherine did not speak. She let out a guttural, furious scream that sounded barely human. She shoved her heavy dining chair back the dark wood, screeching violently against the pristine marble floor. In a flash of terrifying speed, my mother lunged across the wide mahogany table. She knocked over full wine glasses and smashed right through a platter of roasted vegetables, sending crystal shards and food flying everywhere. Before I could even register the danger, her hands were on me. She grabbed the shoulders of my dress and shoved me backward with a vicious, unhinged force. My heavy dining chair tipped backward. I felt a sickening weightlessness as gravity took over. I crashed hard to the marble floor, my back absorbing the brutal impact. Colin yelled my name, instantly leaping from his seat, but Catherine was already on top of me. She scrambled over the fallen chair, her face twisted into a mask of absolute terrifying rage. Then she raised her hand and brought her fist down directly onto my 4-month pregnant stomach. The sharp, blinding physical pain in my abdomen was instantly swallowed by sheer psychological terror. I curled inward, pulling my knees up and wrapping both my arms securely around my belly to create a human shield for my unborn child. I squeezed my eyes shut as Catherine struck my arms and shoulders, kicking wildly at my legs. "No!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings like shattered glass. "No, you cannot have this baby. You cannot be the first. The first grandchild belongs to Brittany. It has to be Brittany. Get rid of it. You have to get rid of that baby right now." I gasped for air, the cold marble pressing harshly against my spine. Every survival instinct screamed at me to protect my core. Colin grabbed Catherine by her shoulders and hurled her backward, throwing her off of me with furious, desperate force. He dropped to his knees beside me, his hands hovering over my shaking body, his face pale with raw terror. "Do not touch my wife!" Colin roared, his voice shaking with a dangerous anger I had never heard from him before. "If you come near her again, I will break your arms." I lay on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, clutching my stomach while hot tears spilled down my cheeks. The physical pain was sharp, but the betrayal was absolute. My own mother had just tried to intentionally harm my unborn child. I looked up through blurred vision, searching for some sign of sanity from my father. William just stood there, staring down at me with cold, calculating eyes. He did not move to help me. He did not reprimand his wife. He simply watched me suffer perfectly, aligned with the monster who had just attacked me. The room descended into utter chaos. Colin wrapped his arms tightly around my shaking shoulders, pulling me into a protective embrace on the floor. Catherine was screaming hysterically about ruined plans and stolen futures. Brittany was sobbing loudly, covering her face with her hands, playing the tragic victim, while her mother tried to physically assault me. And standing frozen at the end of the table, Jamal looked back and forth between his weeping wife and the violent madness of his in-laws, his sharp mind clearly trying to connect the pieces of a puzzle that made absolutely no sense. We were trapped in a nightmare, and the storm was only just beginning. The metallic taste of fear coated my tongue as I lay on the cold marble floor, the sharp aroma of spilled wine and roasted vegetables heavy in the air. Colin knelt over me like a human shield, his broad shoulders blocking Catherine from reaching me again. My hands remained locked protectively around my abdomen, terrified that any movement would harm the tiny life growing inside. I waited for my father to intervene to pull his unhinged wife back, or show a single ounce of paternal concern. Instead, the polished leather of his expensive loafers stepped right over my trembling legs. William did not look angry. He looked profoundly annoyed, as if my assault were nothing more than a minor logistical inconvenience. He casually brushed a speck of dust off his tailored jacket and looked down at me with eyes devoid of human warmth. "Get up, Madeline," William said, his voice as sterile and commanding as a corporate boardroom dictator. "Stop making such a pathetic spectacle of yourself." Colin tightened his grip around my shoulders and glared up at my father. "Are you out of your mind?" Colin shouted, his voice vibrating with raw fury. "Your wife just tried to attack a pregnant woman. I am calling the police right now." "You will do no such thing," William replied coldly, not bothering to look at Colin. His dead eyes remained fixed on me. "Your mother overreacted, Madeline. I will concede that point. However, her underlying frustration is entirely valid and justified." I stared up at the man who had raised me, feeling a cold numbness spread through my veins. "Valid," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "She just tried to kill my baby." "She was trying to protect our family legacy," William stated, stepping closer. "You know exactly how Grandfather Theodore structured the family trust fund. He wrote that document with one very specific ironclad clause. The parent of the firstborn grandchild assumes absolute executive control over all family assets. That means controlling the board of directors, possessing the majority voting shares, and dictating the distribution of the syndicate funds." The horrifying reality of his words crashed over me like a tidal wave. They did not care about a new life. They only cared about the money attached to it. Brittany and Jamal are meant to inherit. William continued, his tone dripping with entitlement. Jamal comes from a prestigious medical investment syndicate here in Chicago. Merging our family assets under Brittany direct control secures our financial dominance for the next century. You and Colin are just independent contractors. You hold no weight in high society. If you birth the first grandchild, the trust fund falls into your useless hands, and I will not allow you to squander everything I have built. You are trying to steal the trust, Colin snarled, positioning himself firmly between me and my father. You are willing to sacrifice your own grandchild for a corporate merger. I am making a necessary business decision, William replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and delivered his ultimate horrific demand. You will go to a private clinic tomorrow morning, Madeline. You will terminate this pregnancy immediately. We will cover all the medical expenses, and we will even pay you a generous inconvenience fee. But you will not have this child. Brittany and Jamal will claim the title of the first grandchild as we planned. I could not breathe. His evil demand completely paralyzed my lungs. My father was standing in his dining room, casually ordering me to end my pregnancy to secure a financial payout for his favorite daughter. From across the room, Brittany suddenly chimed in, her voice whining and petulant. She had dropped her shocked facade. Why do you always have to ruin everything for me, Maddie? She complained, stomping her foot on the floor like a spoiled toddler. I am supposed to be the mother of the heir. You knew how important this was to Mom and Dad. You got pregnant just to spite me. The delusion in her voice snapped me out of my shock. I am a married woman, I shot back, struggling to push myself up into a sitting position while leaning heavily against Colin. I am starting my own family. This has absolutely nothing to do with you or your insane greed. My defiance reignited the absolute madness burning in my mother. Catherine let out another feral shriek, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. You selfish, ungrateful brat, she screamed, her vocal cords straining. You will do exactly as your father says. You owe this family your absolute obedience. Catherine grabbed the edge of the dining table and vaulted herself forward, preparing to launch a second vicious physical attack. Colin instantly shifted his weight, raising his arms to shove her back, ready to defend me with brutal force if necessary. Catherine raised her hand high in the air, her fingers curled into tight fists. She screamed that she would beat the stubbornness out of me herself, that she would force me to comply for the sake of their wealth. Just as she prepared to swing her arm down, a sharp, piercing sound echoed loudly through the cavernous penthouse. The front doorbell suddenly rang out clear and melodic, cutting through the violent tension like a sharp knife. Her raised hand froze mid-air. The wild, unhinged look of violence in her eyes vanished in a split second, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. She dropped her arms strictly to her sides, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath. Panic flashed across her face as she looked toward the grand foyer. She frantically tried to smooth her ruined designer dress and desperately fix her messy hair. The heavy double doors of the penthouse grand foyer swung open with a smooth, decisive motion. The sound echoed through the cavernous space, slicing directly through the lingering tension of the dining room. Catherine froze in place, her hands still frantically pulling at the tangled strands of her hair and smoothing the wrinkled fabric of her ruined designer dress. She plastered a grotesque, trembling smile onto her pale face, desperately attempting to project an image of high society elegance amidst the absolute destruction she had just caused. But her pathetic facade shattered entirely the moment the visitors stepped into the bright light. It was Jamal. He stood in the arched entryway with a look of absolute terrifying ice. His usual warm, diplomatic demeanor, the gentle nature that my parents had constantly mistaken for weakness, had been completely replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He was not alone. Flanking him like two pillars of inescapable justice were his mother, the formidable former Judge Beatrice, and a tall, sharp-eyed man who exuded the unmistakable aura of law enforcement. Detective Ramirez stood silently, taking in every single detail. Beatrice wore a tailored charcoal suit, her posture radiating decades of courtroom authority. She surveyed the penthouse with a gaze that could cut through solid steel, missing absolutely nothing of the pathetic scene before her. Jamal stepped past the grand foyer and strode deliberately into the dining room. The soles of his polished shoes crunched loudly against the scattered shards of broken wine glasses and smeared roasted vegetables. He stopped near the head of the table. His dark eyes scanned the chaotic scene, absorbing the overturned dining chair, the spilled red wine staining the expensive rug like fresh blood, and my father standing rigidly with a look of cornered panic. Then Jamal looked down. He saw me lying on the cold marble floor, gasping for breath, while Colin shielded my pregnant body. He saw the sheer terror in my eyes, the way my arms were locked protectively around my stomach, and the rage radiating from my husband, who was prepared to fight. A dangerous dark storm clouded his features. The veins in his neck pulled tight, and his jaw locked with a fierce, burning intensity. The man who had always played the polite son-in-law vanished forever. He erupted in a sudden visible fury, a silent explosion of pure anger that made the air in the room feel heavy. Catherine took a shaky, uneven step forward, raising her hands in a stammering attempt to defuse the nuclear bomb that had just walked into her home. She babbled a pathetic greeting, her voice cracking into a hysterical chirp as she offered them a drink. She frantically tried to block his view of my bruised shoulders and his defensive stance, attempting to claim that I had simply tripped over my high heels. Jamal did not even dignify Catherine with a single word of response. He looked right through her as if she were an invisible speck of dust. He bypassed her, moving with a predatory grace, until he reached the center of the ruined mahogany dining table. Beatrice followed close behind him, her imposing presence sucking all the oxygen out of the room while Detective Ramirez silently closed the heavy double doors, locking the deadbolt with a loud click, sealing us inside. Colin helped me sit up slowly, keeping his body between me and my parents, as we watched Jamal deliver the final crushing blow. Jamal reached inside his tailored coat and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders sealed with red tape. He raised his arm high and slammed the dense stack of medical files down onto the polished wood of the table. The loud smack reverberated off the high walls, making my father jump and causing Brittany to recoil into her chair. Jamal leaned forward, planting both his hands flat on the table, leaning directly into their private and personal space. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, lethal, and devastatingly clear. He publicly tore down the fabricated reality my parents had built piece by piece, sparing no one from the harsh facts. Jamal stared directly at Brittany, who was shrinking back against the upholstery, her eyes wide with mounting, suffocating terror. He declared that the charade was officially over. He pointed a steady finger at the thick medical files and revealed the devastating, irrefutable truth that had brought him here tonight, accompanied by a detective and a former judge. The files contained certified, legally obtained medical records detailing a major surgical procedure. Jamal announced to the dead, silent, horrified room that his loving wife, the supposed future mother of the family heir, had undergone a secret hysterectomy 3 years ago. The words hung in the air, paralyzing everyone who heard them. Jamal explained with precision that he had known something was wrong for months. He laid out the timeline, his voice cutting through the room like a surgical blade. He revealed how Brittany had lied about visiting fertility clinics, how she had forged documents to pretend she was actively trying to conceive, and how she had manipulated his powerful family into believing they were simply facing natural medical challenges. He exposed the fact that she had removed her ability to ever carry a child long before they were even married, completely eliminating any possibility of her providing the first grandchild required to seize control of the family trust fund. The massive financial empire my parents were ready to murder my unborn child for was a prize they could never win. William and Catherine stared in horror as their daughter and her deception was brought into the light. The undeniable medical proof resting on the polished table meant their carefully planned future was now entirely dead. Colin squeezed my hand gently, acknowledging our relief. The sheer magnitude of the lies Brittany had spun created a silence so profound it felt like the foundation of the building was crumbling beneath our feet. The crushing silence lasted only a few seconds before Brittany completely snapped. The realization that her darkest secret was now lying in plain sight on the dining room table shattered her carefully constructed facade. She let out a high-pitched, wavering sob that sounded more like a cornered animal than a grieving woman. Tears instantly flooded her perfectly made-up face, leaving dark streaks of expensive mascara running down her cheeks. She lunged forward out of her heavy wooden chair, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the lapels of Jamal's tailored jacket. She clung to him desperately, her knuckles turning stark white as she buried her face against his chest, attempting to use her physical proximity to force him into a state of sympathetic compliance. Jamal did not move a single muscle. He stood as rigid as a stone statue, his arms remaining flat at his sides, completely unresponsive to her frantic, desperate touch. Brittany began to wail, launching into a heavily rehearsed victim narrative. She cried out that she had been terrified, that she was entirely paralyzed by the overwhelming expectations placed upon her shoulders. She looked up at Jamal with wide, pleading eyes, spinning a web of toxic gaslighting. She claimed that his powerful family had demanded an heir, that the medical syndicate required a continuation of their legacy, and that she simply could not bear the shame of admitting she was physically incapable of giving them what they wanted. She blamed the immense pressure of their high society circles, stating that she was driven to deception because she loved him too much to lose him. She painted herself as a tragic martyr who had simply made a misguided mistake out of pure desperate devotion. Her pathetic performance did not last long. Former Judge Beatrice stepped forward, and the sheer force of her authoritative presence instantly sucked whatever remaining oxygen existed right out of the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Decades of presiding over the highest courts in Illinois had given her a voice that commanded absolute, undeniable obedience. She reached out and firmly grasped Brittany by the wrist, peeling her clinging hands off her son's jacket with a deliberate, forceful motion. She pushed the weeping woman backward, forcing Brittany to stumble slightly and sink back heavily into her dining chair. Beatrice stood towering over her, a striking figure of immaculate grace and lethal legal precision. She stared down at Brittany with eyes that held absolutely zero pity. She ruthlessly shut down the gaslighting cutting through the theatrical sobbing with a tone of absolute zero tolerance. "Save your tears for an audience who lacks the intelligence to see through them," Beatrice commanded, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "You will not stand in this room and blame my family for your sociopathic deception. We never demanded an heir, we demanded honesty. You gave us a grotesque, calculated fraud." Beatrice turned her sharp gaze toward my parents, who were still standing frozen in shock. She began to methodically dismantle the entire charade piece by piece, exposing the intricate details of their conspiracy like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. She explained that her suspicions had not formed overnight. They had begun months ago, slowly building with every convenient excuse and bizarre medical decision Brittany had made. As the matriarch of a family that controlled a massive medical investment syndicate, Beatrice had immediate access to the most elite private obstetricians and fertility specialists in the entire city of Chicago. Naturally, she had offered these premium services to her daughter-in-law, assuming Brittany would want the absolute best prenatal care money could buy. Instead, Brittany had constantly violently refused. Beatrice detailed how Brittany would become highly defensive whenever the topic of doctors was raised. She claimed she wanted to keep her original physician. She insisted on going to her appointments entirely alone, barring Jamal from ever entering the examination room. She cited extreme anxiety and a desperate need for privacy. At first, Beatrice had respected those boundaries, assuming it was simply the nervous behavior of a first-time mother. But the excuses became increasingly frantic. The ultrasound printouts Brittany brought home looked generic, devoid of the standard medical coding and specific clinic watermarks that a former judge and medical syndicate leader instantly recognized as mandatory protocol. So Beatrice did what she spent her entire career doing. She investigated. She utilized her extensive network and deployed her own private resources to dig into the glaring inconsistencies. She spoke with chilling clarity as she revealed what her investigators had uncovered. There was no obstetrician. There were no prenatal vitamins. There were no clinic visits. There was no baby. Beatrice exposed the fact that the ultrasound images were stock photos purchased online and printed at a commercial shop downtown. She revealed credit card statements that proved the purchase of a high-end weighted silicone prosthetic belly designed specifically for stage and film actors. The entire pregnancy was a masterclass in visual deception, carefully structured to fool a husband who trusted his wife implicitly. Brittany buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her elaborate lies were dragged into the harsh light of reality. But Beatrice was not finished. She knew that a woman as intellectually hollow as Brittany could never have engineered a fraud of this magnitude entirely on her own. Beatrice slowly turned her head, locking her piercing gaze directly onto my mother. Catherine flinched, physically stepping back as the former judge focused her formidable wrath onto the true architect of this waking nightmare. Beatrice pointed a manicured finger directly at Catherine's chest. She publicly declared that this entire sick charade had been masterminded, orchestrated, and funded entirely by Catherine. Beatrice laid out the precise timeline, proving that Catherine had known about Brittany's secret hysterectomy for years. But Catherine also knew the strict, unforgiving rules of Grandfather Theodore's trust fund. She knew that the absolute deadline was approaching and that the parent of the firstborn grandchild would seize total control of the family empire. Catherine had panicked. She knew that Colin and I were healthy, capable, and building a stable life. She recognized the very real threat that I might become pregnant, first legally securing the trust and leaving her and William entirely cut off from the massive fortune they so desperately craved. To prevent that, Catherine had weaponized her own daughter. She had coached Brittany on what to say, how to act, and when to display the fake symptoms. She had forced Brittany into faking a pregnancy to trick the lawyers to beat the clock and to legally lock down the inheritance before I ever had a chance to announce a child of my own. The air in the room grew completely stagnant. The sheer evil of Catherine's psychological manipulation hung over the dining table like a toxic cloud. She had willingly engineered a massive medical fraud, playing with the emotions of Jamal and his entire family purely to secure a financial payout. She had turned her golden child into a criminal conspirator, and then she had tried to physically destroy my actual living baby just to maintain the timeline of her fabricated lie. I sat on the cold floor leaning against Colin, my mind struggling to process the absolute depravity of the woman who had given birth to me. The heavy silence that followed Beatrice's devastating exposure was finally broken by the sound of William clearing his throat. My father straightened his posture, pulling his shoulders back, as if shrugging off the moral bankruptcy of his actions. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, adopting the artificial calm of a corporate shark facing a hostile takeover. For a man who had just been caught aiding and abetting the physical assault of his pregnant daughter, William possessed a terrifying ability to compartmentalize. He looked at Jamal, ignoring the weeping mess of his other daughter, and attempted to pivot the entire situation into a boardroom negotiation. William took a measured step toward Jamal, raising his hands in false diplomacy. He lowered his voice, employing a smooth, conspiratorial tone, designed to appeal to Jamal's business acumen. William insisted they needed to approach this unfortunate misunderstanding with logic rather than raw emotion. He explicitly invoked the concept of family loyalty, twisting the word to protect his own greed. He reminded Jamal of the highly lucrative, deeply intertwined financial investments their two families shared. William painted a grim picture of the catastrophic public relations nightmare that would engulf both the medical syndicate and his asset management firm if the truth about the fake pregnancy and the subsequent violence ever leaked to the Chicago press. He urged Jamal to keep this entire incident strictly behind closed doors, promising massive financial concessions and a highly favorable restructuring of their upcoming corporate merger if Jamal would simply agree to sweep the ugliness under the rug and maintain the public illusion of their union. Jamal listened to my father's pathetic, desperate pitch with an expression of unyielding stone. He did not blink. He did not waver. The cold, calculating fury in his dark eyes only intensified as William desperately tried to put a price tag on basic human decency. When William finally finished his repulsive plea for silence, Jamal let out a sharp, humorless laugh that held absolutely no warmth. Jamal stepped into my father's personal space, his physical presence radiating an overwhelming, dangerous authority that made William instinctively retreat. Jamal coldly rebuffed the entire proposal, his voice vibrating with absolute disgust. He told William that there was not enough money in the entire global economy to buy his silence or his complicity in this sickening family dynamic. He stated clearly that their shared business interests were officially dead, completely severed by the sheer magnitude of the deception. Jamal vowed he would never align his family's honorable legacy with a pair of soulless predators willing to sacrifice their own flesh and blood for a trust fund. Without breaking eye contact with William, Jamal reached out with his left hand and deliberately twisted the heavy gold wedding band off his finger. He turned his attention to Brittany, who was still slumped in her chair, sobbing into her hands. Jamal dropped the gold ring onto the marble floor. The sharp, ringing metallic clatter echoed loudly through the ruined dining room. He announced with a finality that left absolutely no room for debate or negotiation that he was officially calling off their marriage right then and there. He looked down at the woman who had manipulated him and declared he would file annulment papers Monday morning based on gross fraud. Brittany let out a harrowing wail of pure despair, but Jamal had already turned his back on her, completely stripping her of the one thing she valued most. Jamal immediately pulled his smartphone from his coat pocket and dialed 911. William lunged forward, his face flushing dark red with panic, demanding that Jamal put the phone away and keep the authorities out of his home. Detective Ramirez smoothly stepped directly into William's path, placing a firm, unyielding hand squarely on my father's chest, silently warning him not to take another step. Jamal completely ignored my father's frantic protests and calmly requested emergency medical services, giving the dispatcher the exact address of the Gold Coast penthouse and clearly stating that a pregnant woman had just been violently assaulted and required an immediate trauma response. After ending the call, Jamal locked eyes with Catherine and William. He vowed to systematically dismantle their lives, exposing their fraud to every major investor in their portfolio, dragging their names through the mud in every high society circle they cherished, and personally ensuring their asset management firm burned to the absolute ground. He promised complete, undeniable ruin. Within minutes, the heavy doors of the penthouse burst open again. A team of paramedics rushed into the grand foyer, their boots pounding against the marble floors, carrying a collapsible stretcher and trauma bags. They moved with swift, urgent precision, ignoring the frozen expressions of my parents. The first responders pushed right past Catherine, treating her like an invisible obstacle as they dropped to the floor beside me. They began rapidly assessing my vital signs, asking Colin rapid-fire questions about the blunt force trauma to my abdomen and carefully monitoring my breathing. They carefully lifted me onto the stretcher, securing me with heavy straps to prevent any further movement. Colin refused to let go of my hand, staying glued to my side as the paramedics navigated the stretcher through the ruined dining room. We left the penthouse of horrors behind, the heavy doors closing on my parents and their shattered, pathetic lives. The scene instantly shifted from the toxic air of the penthouse to the frantic energy of the downtown streets. The heavy rear doors of the ambulance slammed shut, sealing Colin and me inside the bright clinical interior. The powerful engine roared to life, and the vehicle lurched forward. The piercing rhythmic wails of the ambulance sirens sliced through the dark, freezing Chicago night, screaming a warning to the city traffic as we sped desperately toward the emergency room. My entire existence now narrowed down to the tiny, fragile heartbeat, fighting to survive inside me, completely unaware of the monsters we had just escaped. The heavy ambulance lurched to a sudden, violent halt, throwing us slightly forward against our seatbelts. The rear doors flew open instantly, letting in the freezing night air and the harsh glare of the hospital ambulance bay. Paramedics barked out my vitals in rapid-fire medical shorthand, grabbing the gurney and rolling it out onto the pavement with jarring speed. Colin sprinted right alongside me, his face pale and contorted with sheer panic. He refused to let go of my hand, his grip serving as my only anchor as we hit the automatic sliding glass doors of the emergency room. They parted with a mechanical whoosh, swallowing us into the chaotic, overwhelming environment of Chicago Memorial Hospital. The sterile smell of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol assaulted my senses. The harsh, blinding fluorescent lights passing overhead made me squeeze my eyes shut as the wheels of the stretcher clattered against the linoleum floor. Doctors and nurses swarmed around us, their voices a blur of urgent commands. They rushed me into a curtained trauma bay, immediately transferring my bruised body onto a rigid hospital bed. Nurses descended like a coordinated flock, moving with practiced efficiency as they clipped blood pressure cuffs to my arm, taped a pulse oximeter to my finger, and hooked up various monitors. The rhythmic beeping of the machines echoed the frantic pounding of my own heart. Colin stood pinned in the corner of the small room, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. He looked like a man watching his entire world hang in the balance. A tall doctor with silver hair and a calm, reassuring demeanor pushed his way through the curtain, introducing himself as Dr. Evans. He took one look at my bruised abdomen and immediately ordered a portable ultrasound machine. A nurse squeezed a heavy dollop of freezing blue gel onto my stomach. I held my breath, clenching my jaw so tight my teeth ached. Colin stepped forward, gripping the bed rail, his knuckles turning white. The doctor moved the wand over my skin, his eyes fixed on the small glowing monitor. The silence in the room stretched out for what felt like a painful eternity. Every second that passed without a sound felt like another physical blow. Then a fast, galloping, rhythmic thud filled the small space. It was the strong, unmistakable heartbeat of our baby. A choked sob of pure, absolute relief tore out of Colin's throat. He dropped his head onto the mattress, his shoulders shaking. Dr. Evans offered a small, comforting smile. He confirmed that while I had suffered severe deep tissue bruising and dangerous physical trauma to my abdominal wall, the placenta remained intact and the baby was perfectly safe. He mandated strict bed rest and continuous observation, but assured us the worst was over. I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding since the moment my mother struck me. Colin leaned over, brushing a kiss against my sweaty forehead, his tears mixing with mine. For a fleeting, beautiful minute, we were safe. We had survived the unimaginable. Then a loud, aggressive commotion erupted at the nurses' station just outside our curtain. The sharp, commanding tones of high society entitlement clashed violently with the hushed professional murmurs of the hospital staff. The heavy privacy curtain was suddenly violently yanked back on its metal track. Catherine and William burst into the trauma bay looking completely out of place among the medical equipment in their ruined designer evening wear. Trailing closely behind them was a slick, sharp-suited man carrying an expensive leather briefcase. His perfectly gelled hair and predatory gaze marked him unmistakably as a high-priced, sleazy corporate crisis lawyer. Two uniformed police officers who had been dispatched to the hospital following Jamal's emergency call stepped into the room holding small black notepads, ready to take our statements regarding the assault. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, before Colin could order them out of the room, Catherine launched into a breathtakingly vile theatrical performance. She threw her hands over her face, letting out a loud, ragged sob that echoed through the busy emergency room. She collapsed against William's side, playing the role of a devastated, heartbroken mother to absolute perfection. She looked directly at the police officers with wide, tear-filled eyes and began spinning a completely fabricated, deeply malicious narrative. Catherine cried out that I was suffering from a severe, dangerous psychiatric breakdown. She claimed with a trembling voice that I had always been mentally unstable and prone to violent hysterical fits. She told the officers that I harbored a deeply toxic, lifelong jealousy toward my sister Brittany. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the dinner party, claiming that when Brittany's tragic medical issues were discussed, I had completely snapped. Catherine swore to the police that no one had touched me. She insisted that I had intentionally, maliciously thrown myself onto the hard marble floor, thrashing wildly and hurting my own pregnant body just to ruin the family gathering and cause a massive scene. She claimed the entire assault was a hallucination brought on by my unhinged envy. William stood beside her, nodding solemnly, playing the stoic father dealing with an out-of-control daughter. The sleazy lawyer smoothly stepped forward, handing his embossed platinum business cards to the bewildered officers. He corroborated Catherine's insane fiction, assuring the police that the family was fully prepared to cooperate and fund whatever extensive psychiatric help I desperately needed. He framed the situation not as a crime scene, but as a tragic mental health crisis that required medical intervention rather than a police report. He casually dropped legal buzzwords about involuntary psychiatric holds and mental instability, attempting to legally invalidate everything I might say. My parents were standing in a hospital room, actively trying to silence me by painting me as a hysterical madwoman to protect their own wealth. The two uniformed police officers shifted their weight, their expressions hardening as they listened to Catherine spin her malicious, fabricated tale. The younger officer, looking thoroughly out of his depth in the face of such high society theatricality, began scribbling furiously into his small black notepad. The older, more seasoned officer studied me with a newly narrowed, skeptical gaze. The dynamic in the small curtained trauma bay was actively transforming. My mother was deploying a weapon she had perfected over decades of social climbing, using her polished, tearful victim routine to manipulate authority figures into seeing exactly what she wanted them to see. She was weaponizing my trauma, turning my battered body into evidence of my own supposed insanity. The slick corporate lawyer capitalized on the shifting mood. He stepped smoothly toward the officers, lowering his voice to a tone of sympathetic professional concern. He casually name-dropped two high-ranking judges and a member of the hospital board, subtly reminding the police of the immense wealth and power standing in the room. He suggested that filing a formal assault report would only subject a deeply disturbed, mentally unstable young woman to unnecessary legal scrutiny when what she truly needed was an involuntary psychiatric hold. The implication was clear. They were laying the legal groundwork to have me locked away, silencing me permanently, while completely exonerating themselves from the violent crime they had just committed. I watched the older officer nod slowly, his hand moving away from his radio and resting on his duty belt. He was buying the narrative. Colin reached his absolute breaking point. A low, dangerous growl rattled in his chest, a sound born of pure primal protective instinct. He stepped away from my hospital bed, his broad shoulders squared, placing his body directly between the police officers and my parents. The veins in his neck bulged, and his hands curled into tight, trembling fists at his sides. He locked his furious gaze onto William, completely ignoring the lawyer and the police. Colin was prepared to throw his own freedom away. He was seconds away from launching himself across the small room and physically destroying my father for daring to stand in a hospital and lie to protect his twisted fortune. The older police officer instantly reacted to Colin's aggressive stance. He took a sharp step forward, his hand dropping directly to the taser on his belt, his voice barking a harsh command for Colin to stand back and calm down. Catherine let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, shrinking behind William as if Colin were a rabid animal about to attack them all. They were winning. They were pushing Colin into a violent reaction that would perfectly validate their disgusting lies. I reached out, fighting through the sharp, stabbing pain in my ribs, and firmly grabbed Colin's wrist. My touch grounded him instantly. He froze, his breathing ragged, and looked back at me. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply gave his arm a gentle, reassuring squeeze and pulled him back to my side. I looked past my husband, past the sneering lawyer, and locked eyes directly with the older police officer. I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing my heart rate to steady, refusing to give my parents the hysterical reaction they were banking on. I raised my left arm, turning my wrist so the face of my smartwatch caught the harsh fluorescent light of the trauma bay. With my right hand, I tapped the screen, bypassing the biometric lock. William scoffed loudly, attempting to dismiss my actions. He told the officers that my screen addiction was just another symptom of my erratic, detached mental state. He urged them to call for the psychiatric evaluation team immediately. I completely ignored my father's desperate rambling. I opened a proprietary, highly encrypted application. It was software designed and developed by my own technology firm created specifically for high-stakes corporate espionage and hostile boardroom takeovers. The application ran on an immutable ledger, meaning that once an ambient recording was initiated, the audio file was instantly encrypted, permanently timestamped, and stored on a secure external server. The file could not be edited, spliced, deleted, or tampered with by anyone, not even the creator. It was ironclad court admissible evidence. I had activated the recording protocol the moment Jamal walked into our dining room, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. I tapped the playback icon and set the smartwatch speaker to its maximum volume. The trauma bay fell dead silent as the crisp, crystal-clear audio filled the small space. There was no static, no distortion. The recording began with the chaotic, terrifying sounds of the confrontation. The officers heard the heavy thud of Jamal slamming the medical files onto the mahogany table. They heard Beatrice's cold, authoritative voice ruthlessly dismantling Brittany's fake pregnancy. Then the audio captured the true horror of the evening. Catherine's feral, unhinged shrieks echoed from the tiny speaker, her voice twisting into a mask of pure, violent hatred. The officers listened completely frozen as the recording played the sickening, unmistakable sound of a physical strike. They heard the sharp smack of skin, my sudden breathless scream of pain, and the heavy, terrifying crash of my body hitting the marble floor. They heard Colin shouting in raw fury, desperately trying to protect his pregnant wife from her own mother. The older police officer slowly removed his hand from his taser. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto Catherine with a look of dawning, horrified realization. But the recording was not finished. The audio captured the moment the room grew quiet, followed by the chilling, sterile voice of my father. William's commanding corporate tone filled the emergency room, delivering his vile speech with perfect, damning clarity. Everyone in the trauma bay listened as William explicitly laid out the strict clauses of Grandfather Theodore's trust fund. They heard him demand, without a shred of human emotion, that I visit a private clinic the very next morning to immediately terminate my pregnancy. They heard him casually offer to cover the medical expenses and pay me a generous inconvenience fee to murder his own grandchild, all to ensure that Brittany and Jamal could claim the inheritance and secure his corporate merger. The playback ended with a soft electronic chime. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The absolute truth had just been laid bare, exposing the putrid, rotting core of my parents' pristine high society image. The younger police officer flipped his black notepad closed with a sharp, definitive snap. He looked at the slick corporate lawyer who had suddenly gone perfectly pale. The lawyer, realizing he had just actively participated in lying to law enforcement on behalf of clients who had committed a violent felony, took a very slow, very deliberate physical step away from William. He severed his association without saying a single word. Catherine's fabricated tears vanished instantly. Her dramatic sobbing victim routine evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer trapped terror. She stared at my smartwatch as if it were a loaded weapon. William stood completely rigid, his mouth opening and closing silently, his corporate mask shattering into a million irreparable pieces. He had no pivot, no negotiation tactic, and no financial bribe that could erase the undeniable encrypted proof of his own monstrous greed. The heavy, suffocating silence in the trauma bay stretched for a fraction of a second before reality snapped back into place. The older police officer did not say a single word to Catherine. His stern, weathered face had hardened into a mask of pure professional disgust. He gave a sharp, definitive nod to his younger partner. They moved in perfect unison, stepping right past my stunned father and closing in on my mother with unmistakable intent. Catherine saw them coming. The miraculous transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The weeping, fragile mother routine evaporated into thin air as if it had never existed. Her tear-filled eyes morphed into feral, hateful slits. When the older officer reached out to grasp her arm, she jerked away with a vicious snarl. She spat a command not to touch her with a voice dripping with high society venom. The officer was entirely unfazed by her designer gown or her assumed authority. He swiftly grabbed her wrists, spinning her around and forcing her arms behind her back. Catherine lost her mind completely. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice shredding the sterile quiet of the emergency room. She thrashed wildly, throwing her weight from side to side, her expensive heels kicking out as she tried to break free from the officer's iron grip. She shrieked the classic battle cry of the entitled and cornered, demanding to know if they realized exactly who she was. She threatened to take their badges and destroy their careers, demanding they unhand her that very instant. The older officer smoothly retrieved a pair of steel handcuffs from his duty belt. The heavy metallic ratcheting sound of the cuffs locking tightly around Catherine's wrists cut sharply through her hysterical threats. The officer stated her full name loudly, easily, talking over her continuous shrieking. He informed her that she was officially under arrest for domestic battery and the severe physical assault of a pregnant woman. He began reading her the Miranda rights, his voice completely monotone, as he reminded her that she had the right to remain silent, and that anything she said could be used against her in a court of law. She absolutely did not remain silent. She cursed at the officers, cursed at the medical staff, and hurled absolute vitriol in my direction as they forcibly marched her out of the trauma bay. I watched my mother being dragged away, her designer dress, riding up her perfectly coiffed hair, flying in wild tangled strands. Her screams faded as they shoved her through the automatic sliding glass doors toward the waiting patrol cars. William did not move a single muscle to help his wife. He did not ask the police where they were taking her or demand to ride in the back of the squad car to secure her release. Instead, he retreated to the far corner of the curtained room, his face a mask of sweating, cornered panic. He whipped out his platinum smartphone and began pacing with frantic, jerky steps. The polished corporate titan was completely gone, replaced by a desperate man watching his pristine empire catch fire. I watched from my hospital bed as he scrolled through his massive contact list, his thumbs flying across the screen with urgent precision. He immediately began making rapid-fire calls to his elite political and legal connections. He dropped names of state senators, appellate court judges, and powerful precinct captains, trying to leverage every ounce of his social capital. He spoke in harsh, frantic whispers, demanding immediate favors, cashing in decades of political donations, and throwing his weight around to arrange an emergency discreet bail hearing. He pleaded with unseen power brokers to intercept the arrest report before it hit the morning police blotters and the Chicago gossip columns. He was desperately trying to plug the gaping holes in a rapidly sinking ship, terrified that his lucrative merger with Jamal's medical syndicate was already dead and that his own public ruin was imminent. When he finally ended the last desperate phone call, he stood in the corner breathing heavily. He looked across the room and his eyes locked directly onto mine. There was no paternal regret in his gaze. There was no relief that his grandchild was safe from harm. There was only a cold, petty, and deeply vindictive spite. William needed to exert control. He needed to violently punish someone for the spectacular collapse of his carefully scheduled evening and the impending destruction of his public reputation. He wrongly assumed I was just a helpless, independent consultant, a financially weak daughter, entirely dependent on the family's massive wealth and goodwill. He believed I had no real power of my own. William raised his phone again, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. As the legal patriarch and ultimate guardian of the family's central financial trust, he possessed absolute executive override on all subsidiary accounts. He deliberately opened the encrypted banking portal that managed our family syndicate. Without breaking eye contact with me, he began tapping the screen with deliberate, vicious precision. He navigated straight to the health insurance registry. He maliciously selected my premium top-tier medical policy, the exact policy currently paying for the hospital bed I was lying in, and hit the cancellation override. He revoked my healthcare coverage, effective immediately, right in the middle of a hospital trauma unit, leaving a pregnant woman uninsured after a violent assault. But he was not finished exacting his petty revenge. He swapped applications, moving seamlessly to the central wealth management hub. He systematically locked me out of everything. He froze the checking accounts, canceled the credit limits on every platinum card bearing my name under the family umbrella, and completely suspended my digital transfer capabilities. He was actively trying to bankrupt me with a few swipes of his thumb. He wanted me stranded, saddled with massive emergency room bills, and entirely cut off from the resources I would need to survive the night. William slipped his phone back into his tailored pocket. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket, reclaiming a fraction of his shattered dignity. He walked toward the foot of my hospital bed, his expression returning to that sterile boardroom dictator mask. He stated that I had made a catastrophic error, his voice completely devoid of any human warmth. He told me that I wanted independence from this family, and I now had it. He proudly announced that my insurance was permanently terminated and my accounts were completely frozen. He told me I was entirely on my own in this world and demanded that I never come crawling back to him when reality crushed me. He turned on his heel and walked out of the emergency room, leaving me battered on a hospital bed, blissfully unaware of the absolute shock awaiting him. William's heavy footsteps faded down the sterile hospital corridor, leaving behind a toxic residue that quickly dissolved in the clinical air. Dr. Evans returned shortly after thoroughly reviewing my chart before officially clearing me for discharge. He handed Colin a thick packet of instructions for my mandated bed rest, emphasizing the absolute necessity of keeping my stress levels low to protect the pregnancy. I swung my legs over the edge of the hospital bed, moving with careful, deliberate precision as my bruised ribs protested. Colin hovered protectively, offering his strong arm to steady me as we navigated out of the trauma bay and approached the brightly lit discharge desk. The administrative clerk, a tired-looking woman with reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, tapped her keyboard and politely requested a standard co-payment for the emergency ultrasound and trauma services. I reached into my purse with my uninjured arm, sliding a sleek black bank card across the counter. The clerk swiped it, frowned, and tried again. A sharp electronic beep signaled the rejection. She looked up apologetically, explaining that the card had been officially locked by the primary account holder. William had made good on his petty vindictive threat. He had severed my access to the family trust, canceling my insurance and freezing my checking accounts in a desperate attempt to cripple me. He anticipated a complete financial breakdown, hoping the stress of unpaid medical bills and a lack of resources would force me into submission. I stared at the plastic rectangle resting on the counter. Instead of the crushing despair my father had so gleefully anticipated, a slow, dark smirk spread across my face. I reached deeper into the hidden compartment of my wallet and produced a different card, a heavy, unmarked titanium rectangle tied to a private account William knew absolutely nothing about. The clerk processed it, the transaction approving instantly without a single hitch. As Colin and I walked through the automatic sliding doors into the freezing Chicago dawn, the absolute absurdity of my father's assumptions settled over me. For years, William and Catherine had patronized me, treating me as a harmless mid-level independent consultant who survived entirely on the crumbs of their vast wealth. They genuinely believed my work consisted of drafting generic corporate efficiency reports and organizing meaningless spreadsheets for small local businesses. They never bothered to look past their own towering narcissism to uncover what I actually did for a living. I was not a lowly desk worker. I was the sole founder and managing partner of Apex Vanguard, a highly elite, fiercely private forensic data auditing firm. My company specialized in dismantling complex financial fraud, tracing laundered assets through global shell corporations, and exposing the exact type of corporate malfeasance my father built his entire empire upon. I commanded a formidable team of 30 ruthless digital investigators, brilliant ethical hackers, and relentless forensic accountants. We worked exclusively with international regulatory agencies, federal authorities, and top-tier corporate whistleblowers. The immense personal wealth I generated from recovering stolen billions eclipsed the pathetic trust fund William held over my head by staggering orders of magnitude. He had just declared war on a ghost, completely unaware that he had handed the keys to his own destruction to a woman who dismantled corrupt billionaires as a profession. I looked at Colin as he opened the passenger door for me, his eyes full of silent understanding. It was time to stop playing the quiet, accommodating daughter. 36 hours later, the scene shifted far from the sterile walls of the hospital. High above the bustling streets of downtown Chicago, inside a highly secure glass-walled conference room overlooking the icy blue expanse of Lake Michigan, our counteroffensive officially began. The Apex Vanguard headquarters was a modern fortress of technological security featuring biometric checkpoints, frosted smart glass, that turned completely opaque on command, and soundproof architecture. I sat at the head of a massive slate conference table, resting my hands over my stomach, feeling the slight, reassuring flutter of the baby fighting to survive. Colin sat immediately to my right, his protective fury now honed into sharp tactical focus. Directly across from us sat Jamal. The cold, calculating intensity he had displayed in the penthouse had settled into an immovable, icy resolve. He had arrived 20 minutes early, bypassing his own corporate offices to align himself entirely with our operation. Beside him sat Elias Caldwell, Jamal's most trusted personal attorney, and a legal shark renowned for completely dismantling high society fraudsters in open federal court. Caldwell adjusted his immaculate silk tie, opening a thick leather portfolio filled with preliminary financial dossiers. The air in the room was electric heavy with the weight of impending absolute retribution. I initiated the meeting without preamble, activating a massive high-definition display embedded in the wall behind me. I synced my secure tablet, projecting a staggering intricate web of Williams Shell Company's offshore holding accounts and the highly illegal, deeply buried financial maneuvers he had utilized to mask his asset management firm's staggering insolvency. I explained to the room that my elite team had spent the last 24 hours quietly mapping the entire architecture of his corrupt enterprise. We had already intercepted the frantic digital trails of his recent bail payments for Catherine, exposing the illicit slush funds he used to bribe his way out of trouble. We uncovered years of brazen tax evasion, blatant embezzlement, and systemic client fraud designed to artificially inflate his portfolio. Jamal leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto the glowing data nodes, his sharp business acumen immediately grasping the catastrophic scale of Williams' crimes. Caldwell nodded grimly, his pen flying across his legal pad, already formulating the aggressive strategy to submit the undeniable evidence directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the federal prosecutor's office. We were not merely planning a civil lawsuit for the assault. We were architecting a total, inescapable financial and legal annihilation. Jamal outlined his immediate plan to publicly, brutally sever all ties with the medical syndicate merger, ensuring every major investor in their shared portfolio knew exactly why the lucrative deal was suddenly dead. He planned to leak the termination to the financial press by the end of the day, triggering a massive sell-off. We finalized a coordinated, multi-pronged attack designed to hit my father from every conceivable angle simultaneously, ensuring no legal loophole or political connection could offer an escape route. As I looked around the table at the formidable alliance we had just forged, I knew William's precious empire was already completely reduced to ashes. He just had not smelled the smoke yet. The heavy, soundproof oak door at the far end of the conference room unsealed with a sharp electronic hiss, breaking the heavy silence that hung over the slate table. We all turned as Beatrice strode into the secure space, her presence commanding the immediate, undivided attention of every person in the room. She wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, her posture rigid, her expression carved from the same unyielding ice as her son's. Jamal stood abruptly, clearly caught off guard by his mother's sudden appearance at my highly classified corporate headquarters. He took a step forward, beginning to ask how she had managed to bypass the strict biometric security protocols in the lobby, but Beatrice simply raised a single manicured hand to silence him. She walked directly toward my end of the table, placing a vintage leather handbag onto the polished surface with a quiet thud. She looked at Jamal, offered a brief nod to Colin, and finally locked her piercing, intelligent gaze directly onto me. A razor-thin, deeply knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth, completely shifting the dynamic of our strategic summit. Beatrice turned to address the room formally, announcing that she had never trusted William's artificially polished veneer. She explained that long before the ink was even drafted on the initial merger documents between their powerful medical syndicate and William's asset management firm, her survival instincts had demanded a ruthless, independent investigation. She absolutely refused to merge her family's honorable, hard-earned generational legacy with a man whose financial books seemed a little too perfect and whose smiles never quite reached his eyes. 6 months ago, acting entirely on her own authority and bypassing the standard, easily bribed Wall Street accounting firms, Beatrice sought out the most aggressive, ghost-like forensic auditors in the financial underworld. She exclusively hired Apex Vanguard. Beatrice explained that she had signed the massive retainer blindly, utilizing a web of corporate proxies and communicating only through encrypted channels with the firm's elusive managing partner. She confessed to the stunned table that it was only yesterday, after witnessing my absolute composure in the penthouse and putting the final pieces together, that she realized the brilliant, ruthless investigator dismantling her future in-laws was actually me. I nodded respectfully, acknowledging our covert professional relationship, and turned my attention back to the glowing high-definition display. I reached for my heavily encrypted laptop resting on the table. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing multiple layers of military-grade firewalls and entering the specific decryption keys for the active, highly classified investigation into William's firm. The massive projection screen behind me shifted instantly. The preliminary map of tax evasion dissolved, replaced by an intricate, sprawling digital web of offshore accounts, dummy corporations, and ghost ledgers. The sheer visual scale of the corruption bathed the darkened conference room in an eerie neon blue glow. I directed Caldwell and Jamal to look closely at a specific cluster of routing numbers heavily tied to unregulated banks in the Cayman Islands and the Seychelles. I explained that William was not merely artificially inflating his portfolio to look successful to his elite peers. He was actively, brazenly bleeding his own clients dry to keep his sinking ship afloat. And his primary target was not a faceless corporate entity. I highlighted a massive series of wire transfers, tracing the digital red lines straight from William's shadow accounts back to their absolute origin. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence as the horrible truth materialized on the screen. William and Catherine had been systematically embezzling millions of dollars directly from Jamal's family investment pool. They had exploited the impending wedding and the trust built during the merger negotiations to gain back-channel access to the syndicate's liquid assets. Jamal's jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding together in the quiet room. The betrayal was no longer just a matter of a fake pregnancy or a violent physical assault. It was a profound, calculated financial rape of his family's legacy. Caldwell adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the horrifying numbers, asking the crucial, burning question of where the stolen millions had vanished. William was a greedy corporate shark, but the funds were moving too erratically, burned through at a frantic, chaotic pace that suggested desperate, uncontrolled panic rather than calculated corporate hoarding. I tapped another key, bringing up the expenditure reports linked to the offshore shell companies. The screen populated with a staggering, sickening list of high society vices. The stolen money was not sitting in a secure vault accumulating interest. It was being incinerated to cover Brittany's massive, deeply toxic secret life. My sister was not just a spoiled, manipulative socialite playing house with Jamal's emotions. She harbored crippling, catastrophic addictions that threatened to expose the entire family to ruin. The detailed forensic ledgers exposed astronomical, jaw-dropping losses at underground high-stakes poker tables across the city. The documents revealed massive illicit wire transfers to illegal offshore gambling rings, desperate cash payoffs to aggressive local bookies, and completely unhinged multi-million-dollar tabs at European luxury boutiques. William and Catherine had willingly facilitated the theft of Jamal's wealth simply to shield their favorite daughter from the severe legal and social consequences of her own devastating financial depravity. They had stolen from the very family they were desperately trying to marry into using the wedding as a permanent smokescreen to cover up their monstrous embezzlement. Jamal stared at the irrefutable evidence of his ex-fiancée's financial ruin, the final shreds of any lingering sympathy turning into pure, unadulterated venom. He looked at Beatrice, then at me, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. He demanded that we completely bypass standard civil litigation and go straight for the jugular. He wanted criminal charges filed immediately. He wanted federal agents swarming William's lavish corporate offices, Catherine locked in a holding cell, and Brittany publicly exposed for the relentless parasite she truly was. I closed my laptop with a sharp, definitive snap, sliding the physical dossier across the table toward Caldwell. I looked directly into Jamal's eyes and promised him that before the week was out, every single member of my toxic family would be completely stripped of their stolen wealth, their freedom, and their carefully fabricated reality. The federal machinery Elias Caldwell and Jamal had set in motion was vast and terrifyingly absolute, but bureaucratic gears require a fraction of time to grind to top speed. In that brief, agonizing window before the asset freezes became entirely impenetrable, William managed to cash in his final desperate political favor. He scraped together just enough untraceable liquid capital from a shadow account we had not yet locked down to secure Catherine's release. She walked out of the precinct holding cell with her designer heels clicking against the linoleum, her ego bruised but her venom infinitely multiplied. Returning to their sprawling, suddenly claustrophobic estate, she and Brittany found William pacing the floors like a trapped animal, the reality of their impending financial annihilation finally setting in. They were completely cornered. The embezzlement had been exposed, the medical syndicate merger was publicly dead, and they knew it was only a matter of time before the federal indictments dropped. Cornered animals are always the most dangerous, and my family possessed a unique talent for destruction. Knowing they could not defeat Apex Vanguard in a courtroom or a boardroom, Catherine and Brittany retreated to the only battlefield they truly understood. They chose the court of public opinion. They were entirely incapable of accountability or self-reflection, so they chose to detonate a nuclear bomb of manufactured scandal. Working through untraceable burner phones and leveraging their deep connections within the city's toxic elite social circles, mother and daughter launched a vicious, highly coordinated, and entirely anonymous smear campaign. By the time Colin and I returned to our quiet suburban home, adhering strictly to the doctor's bed rest orders, the digital assault was already underway. It began as a toxic whisper on an exclusive invite-only Chicago Society forum and rapidly mutated into a roaring, uncontrollable wildfire across every major gossip blog and tabloid site in the Midwest. Catherine and Brittany had masterfully woven a distorted, sickeningly plausible narrative designed to ruin me. They leaked fabricated tips and manipulated out-of-context photographs, spinning a tale of absolute betrayal. The headlines screamed that I, the jealous, bitter, and unremarkable middle sister, had orchestrated the entire collapse of the pristine family empire out of pure, unadulterated greed. The lie they sold to the public was breathtaking in its audacity. The anonymous sources accused me of carrying on a torrid, illicit affair with Jamal for months, manipulating him into calling off his wedding to the beautiful, innocent Brittany, just so we could steal the family fortune together. They framed my pregnancy not as a violent tragedy caused by my mother's brutal assault, but as the scandalous, inevitable consequence of my supposed infidelity. They painted my father as a tragic victim, a loving patriarch utterly blindsided by a sociopathic daughter who had used her mysterious tech company to frame her own parents for embezzlement. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The blogs devoured the narrative, hungry for the scandalous downfall of one of Chicago's most prominent families, and they published the lies as absolute truth. The digital storm materialized into physical reality with terrifying immediate speed. Less than 12 hours after the first blog post went live, our peaceful street was completely overrun. A small army of ruthless paparazzi, aggressive tabloid reporters, and news vans descended upon our property, transforming our sanctuary into a chaotic, terrifying media circus. Telephoto lenses bumped against our front gate, searching for any angle into the house. Bright, invasive camera flashes strobed relentlessly through the living room windows, casting harsh, erratic shadows across the walls. Reporters shouted my name through megaphones, demanding statements about the alleged affair and the stolen millions, their voices a constant grating drone of harassment. I was a prisoner in my own home, trapped behind drawn blinds, forced to watch my reputation be systematically eviscerated by the very women who shared my blood. The collateral damage was instantaneous and brutal, extending far beyond the immediate physical harassment. Colin, who had spent years painstakingly building a stellar reputation as an elite architect, found himself caught in the devastating crossfire of the manufactured scandal. The wealthy, status-conscious clients who populated his roster began to panic. By the second day of the media siege, his phone rang incessantly, with cautious, uncomfortable inquiries from investors and developers looking to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Two major contracts, massive commercial projects he had spent months securing, were suddenly placed on an indefinite hold. The board members cited the unavoidable negative optics of associating with a firm whose principal was tied to such an explosive, high-profile public scandal. Colin handled the professional hemorrhage with unwavering stoicism. He shut off his phone, drew the heavy blackout curtains, and sat by my side, pouring his energy into keeping me safe and calm. He refused to show a single ounce of resentment, but the crushing guilt of dragging him into my family's toxic vortex threatened to consume me entirely. I watched him quietly cancel meetings and field polite rejections from his associates, his jaw set in a hard, protective line, and it broke my heart. The psychological pressure mounted to its absolute suffocating peak. The relentless ringing of the landline, the flashing bulbs piercing the darkness of the house, and the vicious, hateful comments flooding my professional and personal inboxes created an atmosphere of pure, concentrated terror. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Catherine's feral glare and Brittany's smug, triumphant smile. They were trying to break my spirit, attempting to induce enough stress to force a miscarriage or drive me to a total public breakdown. My bruised ribs ached with every shallow, anxious breath I took, and the persistent, terrifying fear for my unborn child's safety became a heavy, leaden weight on my chest. I sat in the dim, silent bedroom listening to the muffled shouts of the reporters outside, clutching Colin's hand as the walls of the lie closed in around us. The air in the room grew thin as the weight of the city's judgment pressed down upon our roof, pushing me to the very edge of my endurance, waiting for the perfect calculated moment to strike back. The suffocating darkness of our bedroom offered a stark contrast to the blinding, chaotic storm of paparazzi flashes constantly assaulting the windows. Colin stood near the drawn blinds, his silhouette tense and rigid as another megaphone amplified demand for a statement rattled the glass. His immediate instinct was to step outside to shield me physically from the mob and to publicly tear apart the vicious, fabricated lies Catherine and Brittany had so gleefully woven. I reached out from the edge of the bed, my fingers wrapping firmly around his wrist, grounding him in the quiet of the room. I shook my head slowly, meeting his frustrated gaze with absolute unyielding calm. Engaging in a messy, emotional war of words across social media platforms and tabloid columns was exactly the desperate response my family anticipated. They wanted a public spectacle, a confusing mudslinging match, where the actual truth became completely indistinguishable from salacious gossip. I absolutely refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Silence, when deployed with calculated forensic precision, is a far deadlier weapon than any panicked press release. The physical isolation forced upon us by the relentless media blockade simply transformed our home into an impenetrable, focused command center. Since we could not physically leave the property without igniting a dangerous riot, we moved the battlefield entirely into the digital realm. Jamal joined us through a heavily encrypted, multi-layered video link from the secure basement of his own corporate headquarters. His face on the screen was a mask of cold, controlled fury, his focus razor-sharp and devoid of any lingering heartbreak. Together, we initiated a silent, devastating counterstrike. There would be no leaked counter-rumors, no angry blog posts, and no desperate attempts to sway public sympathy. The court of public opinion was fickle and easily manipulated by cheap scandal, but the federal justice system operated on a different metric entirely. We were going to bury William, Catherine, and Brittany under a massive, inescapable avalanche of hard data. My laptop became the operational epicenter of our strategy. My elite Vanguard team had spent the last several days tearing through the digital fabric of William's offshore banking network, and now it was time to harvest the lethal crop. Catherine and William had arrogantly believed themselves untraceable, utilizing complex cryptocurrency transfers and deeply buried offshore shell accounts to launder the millions they had stolen from Jamal's family. However, they possessed a fundamentally archaic understanding of modern digital finance. They failed to grasp that the blockchain is an immutable, unforgiving entity. Every single stolen dollar they had funneled to illegal gambling rings and luxury retailers to cover Brittany's toxic, sprawling debts was permanently etched into an unalterable public ledger. They had unwittingly left a glowing neon trail leading straight back to their own front door. I spent hours extracting the raw transaction logs, pulling dense, complex hash codes and encrypted wallet addresses from the digital ether and converting them into a clear, undeniable chronological narrative. It was a forensic masterpiece. The data painted a sickeningly precise picture of their boundless greed. We mapped the exact timestamp of every illicit transfer drained from Jamal's syndicate, linking it directly to the corresponding deposit in William's shadow accounts, and ultimately tracing the capital to the specific European luxury boutiques and underground bookies that fueled Brittany's reckless addictions. Colin utilized his brilliant architectural mind to structure the raw data, organizing the massive complex webs of financial fraud into streamlined, easily digestible visual dossiers. He transformed terabytes of raw code into undeniable striking charts that even a layman could instantly comprehend, mapping the flow of stolen money like the blueprint of a doomed building. Jamal supplied the corresponding internal ledgers from his own family's investment pool, providing the final crucial puzzle pieces that proved the funds were siphoned without any authorization. The synthesis of our combined efforts resulted in a devastating package of legal evidence. We stripped away all the emotion, all the toxic family drama, and all the scandalous tabloid fodder that currently consumed the city. What remained was cold, hard, inescapable math. It was a perfectly documented, irrefutable history of felony embezzlement, grand larceny wire fraud, and systemic tax evasion. The dossiers we meticulously built were not merely accusations or speculative theories. They were ready-made federal convictions packaged and tied with a digital bow. The next crucial step was ensuring this digital guillotine fell into the exact right hands. Submitting the evidence to a local precinct captain ran the catastrophic risk of the files disappearing into the hands of someone on William's extensive political payroll. We needed an untouchable, fiercely independent operative. I utilized my secure backchannels to establish a direct encrypted line to Detective Ramirez, a notoriously relentless investigator within the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Ramirez had been quietly circling the periphery of Williams' subsidiary companies for months, sensing the systemic rot, but lacking the definitive proof required to pierce the formidable corporate veil. I did not just offer Ramirez an anonymous tip, I handed him the entire dismantled architecture of a billionaire's criminal empire. We packaged the raw, unalterable blockchain logs, the offshore bank routing numbers, and the corresponding internal theft reports onto highly secure physical hard drives. We established a strict protocol for a silent, perfectly timed physical drop, ensuring the legal chain of custody remained absolutely pristine and untainted by the media circus still raging outside my home. Ramirez and his federal counterparts immediately recognized the staggering magnitude of the files they were receiving. This was the kind of bulletproof, sprawling corporate fraud case that permanently defined legal careers. With the evidence securely staged and the federal authorities fully briefed and mobilizing their strike teams, our final weapon was patience. We mapped out the exact timing of the legal strike. We would let Catherine and Brittany exhaust their frantic energy fueling the tabloid fires. We would allow William to believe his desperate final smear campaign had succeeded and that he had successfully buried the truth beneath a mountain of manufactured gossip. We needed them to feel completely arrogantly invincible right up until the moment the door was kicked in. The trap was definitively set, the steel jaws pulled back and waiting. As the aggressive reporters outside continued to shout my name into the freezing air, demanding a frantic defense against the lies, I simply closed my laptop and let them scream. The silence in our war room was absolute, a quiet, deadly countdown, ticking away the final hours of my family's pristine, fraudulent reality. While the deafening silence reigned inside our fortified home across the city, my sister was preparing for her ultimate triumph. Brittany craved the spotlight, treating attention as a vital currency required for survival. With her wedding spectacularly canceled and Jamal's immense wealth slipping through her manicured fingers, she desperately needed to reclaim control of the narrative. She decided to exploit the intense media frenzy we had ignited, weaponizing her social media presence to deliver a final crushing blow to my reputation. She positioned her smartphone on a sleek tripod in the center of her bedroom, carefully arranging the lighting. She applied her makeup with deliberate theatrical precision, ensuring her face looked appropriately pale and distressed, completely masking the toxic reality of her intentions. The digital trap we had set with federal authorities was quietly tightening its snare around William's empire, but Brittany remained arrogantly oblivious. She tapped the screen, initiating a live broadcast to her massive following. Thanks to the explosive gossip columns Catherine had orchestrated over the past 48 hours, Brittany's viewer count skyrocketed instantly. Thousands of strangers flooded the stream within seconds, hungry for the promised spectacle of high society drama. Brittany stared into the camera lens, letting a single perfectly timed tear slip down her cheek. She began her performance with a trembling, breathless voice, thanking her followers for their supposed outpouring of support during the most devastating week of her life. She launched into a sickeningly fabricated monologue, painting a masterpiece of absolute manipulation. She described her ruined wedding not as the direct result of her own catastrophic financial betrayals, but as the tragic casualty of an unhinged, deeply jealous sibling. She looked directly into the camera and lied with breathtaking ease, claiming I had harbored a secret obsession with Jamal for years. She spun a wild, entirely fictional tale of me seducing her fiancé, feeding him vicious lies, and intentionally destroying her future out of vindictive spite. She clutched a lace handkerchief, dabbing at her eyes as she described the profound heartbreak of being betrayed by her own flesh and blood. The live chat, scrolling rapidly up the side of her screen, erupted with overwhelming sympathy. Thousands of digital strangers validated her manufactured victimhood, hurling absolute vitriol at my name, completely ignorant that they were being masterfully manipulated by a seasoned predator. Brittany basked in the digital adulation, her ego swelling with every supportive comment. She felt entirely invincible, riding the high of public sympathy and believing her mother's smear campaign had successfully buried the truth forever. She prepared to deliver the emotional climax of her broadcast, adjusting her posture to project fragile resilience. But just as she opened her mouth to lament her shattered wedding dreams one final time, a harsh red banner notification suddenly dropped down from the top of her smartphone screen. It was a high-priority alert from her elite international banking application. Brittany frowned, momentarily annoyed by the visual interruption. She subtly reached out, intending to swipe the notification away and maintain her weeping performance. Before her finger could brush the glass, a second notification violently stacked on top of the first, then a third. The alerts multiplied with terrifying speed, completely obscuring the video feed of her face. A frantic text message from William's lead defense attorney flashed across the screen, demanding she contact him immediately. The fragile victim persona faltered. A flash of genuine, unscripted confusion crossed her features, instantly broadcast to the tens of thousands of viewers watching her every move. Unable to suppress her rising panic, Brittany made a catastrophic error. She swiped the banner alert, minimizing the live camera feed and forcing the banking application to open directly on her screen. She forgot that her broadcasting software was set to mirror her display. In a fraction of a second, the entire audience was staring directly at her private financial dashboard. The numbers displayed were not the comforting endless zeros she was accustomed to seeing. Across the top of the interface, stamped in bold crimson letters, was a stark legal mandate. Her primary checking accounts, her offshore routing hubs, and her platinum credit lines were entirely locked. A massive block of text cited specific federal codes for wire fraud, grand larceny, and the immediate freezing of all assets pending an active FBI investigation. The digital guillotine had dropped perfectly on schedule. Brittany gasped, a sharp, ugly sound echoing through the phone's microphone. She frantically tapped the screen, her fingers jabbing the glass with escalating violence as she tried to force the application to refresh. She backed out and rapidly opened a secondary, heavily encrypted wealth management portal, the one William used to funnel the stolen syndicate funds directly into her personal accounts. The audience watched in real time as that application also loaded a glaring, inescapable federal lock screen. The Department of Justice seal watermarked the background, indicating a total, uncompromising asset seizure. The stolen millions she had relied upon to fund her toxic addictions were gone, permanently vaporized by the undeniable forensic evidence we had handed to Detective Ramirez. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The meticulously crafted mask of the innocent bride shattered into a million jagged pieces. Brittany completely lost her mind on the live broadcast. She let out a piercing scream of pure terror, her voice shredding the microphone. She hurled her phone across the room in a blind, violent rage. The device hit the wall with a sickening crack, bouncing onto the hardwood floor, the camera lens now angled awkwardly toward the ceiling. The live feed continued to broadcast the chaotic audio of her total psychological collapse. Viewers heard the sound of shattering glass as she began tearing her immaculate bedroom apart, throwing expensive perfumes against the walls. They heard her shrieking, William's name screaming hysterically about federal agents and empty accounts. Her voice stripped of all its high society polish, replaced by the feral panic of a cornered criminal realizing the absolute finality of her ruin. The chat function exploded into a frenzy of shocked realization as the viewers connected the federal seizure notices to her unhinged meltdown. The internet immortalized the exact moment her pristine empire burned to the ground before she finally stomped on the phone, plunging the broadcast into sudden, permanent darkness. The sudden, permanent darkness of Brittany's shattered screen was the final nail in the coffin of their public relations strategy, but William and Catherine were entirely immune to reality. While their daughter's digital implosion trended globally rapidly, generating millions of views and solidifying their status as federal targets, the older couple refused to surrender to the inevitable. They were bleeding cash at a catastrophic rate, completely locked out of their primary offshore accounts, and staring down the barrel of imminent arrest warrants. Panic, especially in those accustomed to absolute privilege, often breeds profound, breathtaking delusion. In a stunning display of arrogant desperation, they decided that the only way to survive the crushing financial deficit was to manufacture the illusion of unbothered, overwhelming prosperity. If they could just secure one more influx of unregulated capital, one massive injection of blind investment from an uninformed backer, they believed they could hire a fleet of shadow attorneys and slip through the closing federal net. They desperately needed a hunting ground, and they blindly chose the most exclusive event of the Chicago social season. The annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala was a legendary institution, a glittering high society assembly of the Midwest's most powerful old money families, corporate titans, and political kingmakers. This year, the event was heavily sponsored and curated by Beatrice's elite medical syndicate network. Security was notoriously tight, operating as a fortress of biometric scans and fiercely vetted guest lists, but William still retained a few hollow, decaying favors from his former life. as a respected asset manager. Utilizing a heavily compromised associate and a significant portion of his last remaining untraceable cash reserves, he managed to smuggle himself and Catherine through a side entrance. They effectively crashed an event designed and populated by the very people actively engineering their destruction. Down on the sprawling, gold-leafed ballroom floor, Catherine strutted through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos as if she owned the building. She wore an aggressive crimson silk dress, her neck heavy with ostentatious diamonds she had likely removed from a hidden wall safe just hours prior. Her face was a masterclass in sociopathic control. She wielded a dazzling, completely vacant smile, greeting minor acquaintances and local socialites with air kisses and high-pitched musical laughter. She deflected any whispered questions about the tabloid rumors or Britney's viral internet meltdown with practiced dismissive waves of her manicured hand. She loudly labeled the federal investigation as a ridiculous temporary administrative misunderstanding, drummed up by jealous, less successful competitors. Beside her, William was a study in barely contained panic masked by expensive conservative tailoring. He moved aggressively from one cocktail table to another, his eyes darting frantically as he zeroed in on elderly widows, naive inheritors, and newly wealthy tech entrepreneurs who might not be fully briefed on the day's devastating financial news. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, pitching what he described as highly exclusive, time-sensitive offshore investment opportunities. He promised exorbitant, mathematically impossible returns, sweating profusely under the heat of the crystal chandeliers as he desperately tried to reel in a lifeline to cover the massive gaping crater in his accounts. He was a drowning man trying to sell water to the ocean, completely oblivious to the amused, disgusted glances exchanged by the elite attendees behind his back. The rumors had already saturated the room. They were social pariahs performing a desperate, macabre dance on a burning stage. What neither William nor Catherine realized as they frantically worked the perimeter of the dance floor was that their entire pathetic performance was being monitored from directly above. The Sterling Foundation Gala featured an exclusive glass-enclosed VIP lounge suspended over the main ballroom, an architectural vantage point reserved strictly for the event's most esteemed benefactors and honored guests. I sat comfortably on a velvet chaise lounge in the center of that secure overlook, nursing a glass of sparkling water. I was not there as an anonymous interloper, a +1, or a disgraced outcast. I had been formally invited by Beatrice herself, holding the highly esteemed title of the Foundation's honorary cybersecurity advisor. After Apex Vanguard had successfully untangled the complex toxic web of Williams' embezzlement, Beatrice's syndicate had immediately retained my firm's services on a massive retainer to permanently fortify their internal digital infrastructure. Tonight was supposed to be a quiet, elegant celebration of our covert professional alliance. Instead, it had transformed into a front-row seat to my family's ultimate unscripted humiliation. I rested my forearms against the cool glass of the balcony barrier, looking down at the swirling crowd below. Colin stood directly behind me, his hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder, his sharp eyes tracking William's erratic predatory movements across the room. Jamal and Beatrice were stationed at a private table nearby, silently toasting with flutes of champagne as they watched the man who had tried to steal their legacy humiliate himself for pennies. It was a surreal, intoxicating reversal of power. For my entire life, Catherine had looked down on me, consistently casting me as the unremarkable, invisible disappointment, while she paraded her wealth and favored daughter for the world to admire. Now, the physical reality perfectly mirrored our new dynamic. She was trapped in the crowded, noisy pit below, desperately peddling lies, to survive her fake smile, stretching her face into a tight, desperate grimace. Meanwhile, I sat high above the fray, untouchable, pregnant, and fiercely protected by the powerful allies I had earned through sheer intellect and absolute resilience. I watched Catherine approach a wealthy shipping magnate, her hands fluttering as she tried to spin her web of toxic charm. She was completely blissfully unaware that the architect of her impending doom was watching her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to signal the authorities, who were already gathering quietly in the lobby downstairs. The ambient noise of the ballroom shifted as a grand orchestral chime echoed through the Sterling Foundation gala, signaling the beginning of the keynote address. The sea of elite attendees parted seamlessly, their designer gowns and tailored suits rustling like a singular wave as Beatrice made her slow, commanding ascent to the crystal podium. From my secure vantage point in the glass-enclosed VIP lounge, I watched William's posture physically transform. He actually puffed out his chest aggressively, adjusting his silk tie with a sickeningly confident smirk. In his desperate, fractured reality, he firmly believed this was the moment Beatrice would publicly endorse their long-dead merger. He thought she was about to provide the ultimate social proof to the wealthy targets he and Catherine had just spent the last hour aggressively courting. He nudged Catherine, pulling her close so they could stand front and center, fully expecting the venue's spotlight to find them for a thunderous round of applause. Beatrice tapped the microphone, the sharp, authoritative sound demanding absolute silence across the massive, echoing ballroom. She began speaking with a velvet-draped lethality, thanking the esteemed guests for their lifelong commitment to Chicago's philanthropic endeavors and medical advancements. She spoke eloquently about the foundations of generational wealth, emphasizing that true legacy is built upon a bedrock of absolute trust, ethical management, and unyielding transparency. Down on the polished floor, William nodded along vigorously, adopting an expression of profound statesman-like agreement. He was entirely blind to the razor-sharp tension radiating from Jamal, who stood just a few feet away from me in the VIP lounge, his eyes locked onto William like a sniper acquiring a highly valued target. Then Beatrice's tone dropped a full octave. The hospitable warmth instantly bled out of her voice, replaced by freezing, unforgiving steel. She announced to the captivated audience that the medical syndicate's recent expansion plans had required them to deeply evaluate their potential financial partners. She stated that while searching for an asset management firm to handle their massive liquid reserves, they had uncovered a terrifying systemic reality lurking beneath the polished veneer of one of the city's most recognizable financial institutions. The ballroom fell so utterly silent that the clinking of a dropped champagne flute sounded like a gunshot. William's eager smile began to falter, a creeping primal realization finally beginning to penetrate his thick armor of delusion. Catherine's grip on his arm tightened until her knuckles turned bone white, her perfectly painted lips parting in sudden, unscripted panic. Without breaking eye contact with the breathless crowd, Beatrice delivered the lethal blow. She clearly and deliberately announced that effective immediately, her family's syndicate had filed a comprehensive, multi-million-dollar federal fraud lawsuit against Williams' asset management firm. She did not use polite euphemisms or obscure corporate doublespeak. She boldly articulated the exact devastating charges to the room: systemic embezzlement, gross fiduciary negligence, and the deliberate calculated theft of client funds to cover personal illicit debts. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the hundreds of attendees. The physical reaction was immediate and brutal. The wealthy socialites and corporate titans who had been standing near my parents instinctively recoiled, physically backing away from William and Catherine as if they were suddenly highly contagious. A wide, empty circle formed around my mother and father on the ballroom floor, isolating them in a glaring, inescapable pit of social and professional ruin. William's face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing as he searched frantically for a way to interrupt, to spin a lie, to salvage any shred of his rapidly evaporating dignity. But Beatrice possessed the microphone, the platform, and the absolute authority of the room. She raised a single manicured hand to quiet the escalating murmurs of the outraged guests. She explained that this catastrophic fraud would have gone completely undetected, buried forever beneath complex layers of offshore shell companies and international ghost accounts, if not for the intervention of a singularly brilliant, uncompromising forensic auditor. She commanded the lighting technician to shift the primary spotlight. A brilliant, blinding beam of white light suddenly shot across the vast expanse of the ballroom ceiling, cutting through the darkness and illuminating the glass balcony of the VIP lounge directly above. The spotlight bathed me in a brilliant, undeniable glow. I stood up from the velvet chaise lounge, stepping forward to the edge of the glass barrier with Colin standing tall and fiercely protective right beside me. Down on the floor, hundreds of faces tilted upward, their expressions morphing from shock into absolute stunned comprehension. Beatrice's voice echoed powerfully through the speakers, filling every corner of the venue with undeniable truth. She did not introduce me as the scandalous, jealous sibling from the vicious tabloid blogs, nor did she refer to me as William and Catherine's disgraced, unremarkable middle child. She formally introduced me as the formidable anonymous managing partner of Apex Vanguard. She publicly credited my unmatched cybersecurity expertise, my flawless financial tracking, and my relentless investigation for saving the syndicate from total catastrophic ruin. Looking down from the illuminated balcony, I locked eyes directly with Catherine. The mask of the arrogant, untouchable matriarch completely shattered in an instant. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as the full weight of her reality finally crashed down upon her. She realized in front of the entire Chicago elite that the daughter she had spent 30 years emotionally abusing, discarding, and publicly labeling a profound disappointment was the exact architect of her absolute destruction. William staggered backward, clutching his chest, as if the air had been violently sucked from his lungs, his eyes darting frantically toward the ballroom exits in a desperate bid for escape. But the trap was already sealed. Through the grand glass doors of the main lobby, the distinct uniform silhouettes of federal agents began moving swiftly into the building, their gold badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers, fully prepared to finish the job I had started. The heavy brass-handled doors of the main ballroom burst open, disrupting the stunned silence that had fallen over the gala. Detective Ramirez marched at the vanguard of a dozen federal agents, their dark windbreakers cutting a sharp, violent contrast against the sea of pastel silks and shimmering sequins. The transition from Beatrice's damning keynote speech to the physical reality of law enforcement storming the Sterling Foundation charity event was instantaneous and absolute. The elite crowd, previously paralyzed by the scandal unfolding from the podium, suddenly fractured in a wave of manic, panicked energy. High society attendees gasped, clutching their pearls and champagne flutes, practically climbing over one another to distance themselves from the center of the floor. The ambient music abruptly cut out, replaced by a rising chorus of shocked whispers and the heavy synchronized thud of tactical boots against the polished hardwood. William and Catherine were left entirely isolated in a rapidly widening circle of empty space. For a man who had spent his entire life projecting an aura of impenetrable authority, William's physical collapse was a pathetic spectacle. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, babbling incoherently at the approaching agents about misunderstandings, illegal searches, and his immediate right to high-powered legal counsel. Catherine, meanwhile, let out a sharp, breathless shriek as a stoic, broad-shouldered agent firmly grasped her arm to prevent her from retreating into the crowd. The heavy diamonds around her neck caught the harsh glare of the camera flashes as the society press, initially hired to cover a night of prestigious philanthropy, eagerly pivoted their lenses to capture the absolute destruction of a Midwestern financial dynasty. The strobe lights flickered like a violent, localized lightning storm, immortalizing every bead of sweat on William's forehead and the sheer, unadulterated terror twisting Catherine's heavily manicured face. Beatrice's private security detail immediately flanked the federal agents, forming a synchronized, impenetrable human wall around my parents. They were not afforded the quiet, merciful dignity of a backdoor exit. The authorities marched them directly through the center aisle of the ballroom, a highly publicized walk of shame orchestrated to maximize their social execution. I remained at the glass barrier of the VIP lounge, my expression a mask of cool, detached resolution. as I watched the perpetrators of my lifelong torment being physically and forcefully paraded out of the venue. Catherine looked up one final time, her eyes wide and feral, seeking some miraculous intervention from the peers she had just been boasting to minutes prior. But she found only averted gazes, disgusted sneers, and the cold, unyielding reality of my own stare looking down upon her. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the chaotic noise of their ejection and leaving the ballroom buzzing with the electric thrill of witnessed ruin. Outside the venue, the biting Chicago wind hit William and Catherine with the force of a physical blow. They were shoved unceremoniously onto the concrete pavement of the loading dock area, the federal agents formally serving them with a thick stack of sealed indictments, asset seizure notifications, and strict mandates to surrender their passports before dawn. The agents did not place them in handcuffs right then and there, implementing a calculated legal strategy to let them panic, bleed out their remaining resources, and potentially lead the forensic teams to any hidden secondary conspirators. However, the threat of impending unavoidable prison time hung over them like an executioner's blade. They were stripped of their manufactured dignity, permanently locked out of their stolen accounts, and banished from the only social circle that mattered to their hollow identities. Catherine leaned against the cold brick wall of the alleyway, her breathing ragged and shallow. She tore the diamond necklace from her throat, the heavy stones suddenly feeling like a suffocating radioactive chain, and hurled the jewelry into her designer purse. She demanded that William fix the situation immediately, her voice shrill and hysterical, completely unable to process the absolute permanence of their defeat. But William was no longer listening to her frantic, echoing demands. His initial blinding panic was rapidly mutating into a toxic, concentrated venom. He stared at the glowing windows of the ballroom high above his mind, racing through the smoking wreckage of his empire. The offshore accounts were entirely seized. His professional reputation was incinerated. His most lucrative network had just publicly humiliated him on the grandest scale imaginable. There was no magical influx of cash coming to save them from the federal guillotine. The only thing left in his possession was pure, unadulterated spite. If he was going down, he was absolutely determined to ensure I suffered alongside them. He pulled out his encrypted smartphone, ignoring the dozens of missed calls from panicked associates and furious investors, and dialed his lead corporate attorney. The lawyer answered with a trembling voice, clearly already aware of the viral catastrophe unfolding across the late-night news networks. William barked a sharp, furious command, ordering the man to ignore the federal warrants for the moment and immediately access the sealed archives of Grandfather Theodore's original estate planning documents. William remembered a specific archaic clause buried deep within the legal jargon of the family trust, a weapon he had kept in his back pocket for decades, but never truly needed to wield until tonight. Grandfather Theodore had been a man obsessed with legacy, structural integrity, and the pristine reputation of the family name. When he drafted his final will and testament, dividing the foundational assets that William had eventually cannibalized to build his fraudulent empire, he included a strict, highly subjective morality provision. The clause explicitly stated that any heir or beneficiary found to be actively bringing disgrace, public scandal, or intentional damage to the family's societal standing could be summarily stripped of their birthright, entirely disinherited, and permanently excised from the trust by a majority vote of the primary shareholders. It was a draconian legal loophole designed to protect the patriarch's hard-earned empire from reckless, irresponsible descendants, but in William's twisted, desperate mind, it was the perfect instrument for his final act of vengeance. Standing in the freezing alleyway, surrounded by the debris of his shattered life, William dictated his terms to his terrified attorney. He mandated the immediate drafting of an emergency summons, initiating an impromptu mandatory shareholder and family meeting for 8 o'clock the very next morning at their primary corporate headquarters. He intended to weaponize the very scandal he had created, twisting the narrative to accuse me of orchestrating a malicious, unfounded smear campaign that had irreparably damaged the company's stock value and the family's public standing. He planned to use the loophole to officially vote me out of the family, legally severing any remaining ties I had to Theodore's legitimate, untouched foundational assets. It was a completely unhinged, reckless strategy, born from the mind of a cornered predator, wildly lashing out at the person who had trapped him. William knew he was heading for a federal penitentiary, but his staggering ego demanded that he inflict one last catastrophic wound upon the daughter who had outsmarted him. He hung up the phone, a grim, terrifying smile stretching across his face, completely unaware that his desperate summons was exactly the final fatal misstep I had anticipated he would make. The dawn broke over Chicago in a wash of slate gray, casting a harsh, unforgiving light across the glass and steel canyons of the financial district. 50 stories above the awakening city, the executive boardroom of the family's primary corporate headquarters was a freezing chamber of concentrated malice. William sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, his eyes bloodshot and ringed with deep purple shadows, after a sleepless night of frantic legal maneuvering. Catherine sat rigidly to his right, her face a pale, tightly drawn mask hiding the sheer panic of her impending federal processing beneath layers of expensive foundation. To his left sat Brittany. Her presence was a jarring testament to their shared delusion. Despite having her assets completely frozen and broadcasting her own unhinged psychological collapse to millions the night before, she wore a tailored designer suit and a violently smug expression, clinging desperately to her father's promise of vengeance as her last remaining lifeline. Surrounding them were the remaining compromised members of the corporate board, a collection of spineless sycophants and terrified executives William had effectively bought or blackmailed over his decades in power. The air in the room was suffocating thick with the smell of stale coffee and the palpable dread of men and women who knew the federal authorities were actively dismantling their lives. William had summoned them under the strict absolute mandate of emergency crisis management. His plan was brutally simple. He intended to invoke Grandfather Theodore's draconian morality clause, explicitly blaming the entire federal raid, the public scandal, and the stock plummet on my alleged vindictive sabotage. He was preparing to hold a swift, immediate vote among his puppet board members to formally declare me a disgrace to the family name, severing me from the trust and legally stripping me of any remaining inheritance or corporate authority. William adjusted his posture, straightening his silk tie and gripping the heavy wooden gavel resting on the table. He cleared his throat, opening his mouth to initiate the final desperate execution of my birthright. Before a single syllable could escape his lips, the heavy soundproof double doors of the boardroom swung open with a smooth, decisive glide. The quiet click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I stepped over the threshold, moving with a calm, unhurried grace that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen from the space. I did not look like the disgraced, defeated outcast William had summoned to slaughter. I wore a sharp charcoal maternity suit projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. Colin walked a half-step behind my right shoulder, his posture relaxed, but radiating a quiet, lethal vigilance that made the nearest board members physically shrink back into their leather chairs. But it was the man walking to my left who truly paralyzed the room. Elias Caldwell was a legend within the city's legal echelons. A formidable, silver-haired attorney with a reputation for mercilessly dismantling corporate titans and corrupt dynasties. He was not a man who took desperate cases. He was the man you called when you already held the winning hand. William's bloodshot eyes bulged as he registered Caldwell's presence. The smug, vicious satisfaction completely drained from Brittany's face, replaced by a sudden, sickening wave of uncertainty. Catherine instinctively gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white as she stared at the man walking beside me. William slammed his hand down on the wood, abandoning the gavel in his sudden blind panic. He demanded to know what we were doing, interrupting a closed high-security executive session. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice echoing shrilly against the glass walls as he loudly declared that I had been officially summoned only to be formally expelled. He began to rant frantically to the terrified board, claiming I had maliciously destroyed the firm's public standing and that he was immediately invoking Theodore's morality provision to cast me out permanently. He demanded his loyal executives raise their hands to vote, screeching for my absolute disinheritance. Not a single board member moved. They stared in paralyzed horror at Elias Caldwell, who had stepped forward, completely ignoring William's hysterical, high-pitched demands. Caldwell did not shout. He did not need to. He commanded the room with the effortless, crushing gravity of absolute truth. He approached the head of the table, stopping just inches from where William was visibly hyperventilating. Caldwell unlatched his vintage leather briefcase with a sharp metallic snap. He reached inside and withdrew a thick, aged document bound in heavy parchment and secured with an intact crimson wax seal. Caldwell looked directly into William's panicked eyes and spoke with a voice like grinding stone. He informed the room that William's emergency vote was entirely irrelevant, illegal, and completely nullified. He stated that the trust documents William had been operating under for the past 2 decades, the very papers he was attempting to weaponize, were heavily manipulated, fraudulent amendments created shortly after the patriarch's passing. With a slow, deliberate motion, Caldwell placed the weathered document directly into the center of the polished mahogany table. The heavy thud resonated through the bones of everyone present. He announced that he was placing Grandfather Theodore's original, unaltered, and legally binding final will and testament into the official corporate record. It was the true foundational document, hidden safely away by Theodore's most trusted allies for years, explicitly waiting for the exact moment William's greed finally consumed his judgment. The air in the boardroom grew impossibly cold. Caldwell smoothed his hand over the aged parchment and calmly explained its contents to the frozen executives. The original will completely negated the subjective morality clause William had intended to use. Instead, it contained an ironclad, irreversible directive. Recognizing William's inherent moral decay long before his death, Grandfather Theodore had structured the true trust to automatically transfer absolute majority voting power and total control of the foundational assets directly to his grandchildren upon the discovery of any financial malfeasance by his son. Furthermore, it specifically named me as the sole ultimate executor of the estate in the event of a federal indictment against the primary asset managers. William collapsed back into his leather chair, the color draining from his face until he resembled a hollowed-out corpse. The delusion he had clung to in the freezing alleyway shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Catherine let out a quiet, pathetic whimper, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Brittany stared at the sealed document on the table, her eyes wide and vacant, as the reality of her total, inescapable poverty finally broke through her arrogance. The boardroom remained deadly silent, the balance of power permanently and undeniably shifting as I stepped forward to claim the empire they had so desperately tried to steal. The absolute silence in the boardroom was heavy, thick with the metallic taste of adrenaline and the scent of impending ruin. Elias Caldwell let the suffocating stillness stretch, allowing the gravity of the moment to crush whatever fragile, lingering hopes William still harbored. The silver-haired attorney stood at the head of the mahogany table, his posture immaculately straight, a living monument to legal retribution. He looked down at the weathered parchment of Grandfather Theodore's original will, then shifted his piercing gaze to my father, whose face had taken on the pale, waxy sheen of a cornered animal. Caldwell adjusted his reading glasses with a slow, deliberate precision that seemed to stretch seconds into hours. He cleared his throat, a sharp, authoritative sound that made the compromised executives seated around the perimeter flinch in unison. Caldwell began to read, his voice resonating with the cadence of a judge delivering a fatal verdict. He addressed the central lie that had dictated my family's toxic dynamics for the past 2 decades. He explained that William and Catherine had structured their entire existence, their lavish spending, and their blatant favoritism around a massive fundamental misconception. They had believed, based on the fraudulent amendments William had coerced out of compromised attorneys years ago, that the ultimate control of the family dynasty was perpetually secured by a bloodline clause. They had operated under the arrogant assumption that the immense generational wealth would automatically default to the parent of the first grandchild, a twisted interpretation of legacy that had fueled their relentless push to elevate Brittany and secure her high society marriage. They thought they had engineered a foolproof safety net, believing that simply producing an heir guaranteed them permanent access to Theodore's limitless fortune. Caldwell looked up from the document, a harsh, unforgiving smile touching the corners of his mouth. He informed William that grandfather Theodore had never been a fool. The patriarch had possessed a terrifying microscopic insight into human nature, particularly the fatal flaws of his own son. Theodore had seen the rot festering within William long before his passing, recognizing the insatiable greed and profound moral bankruptcy that would inevitably lead the company toward catastrophe. Theodore had anticipated this exact scenario. He knew that William would attempt to manipulate the legal structure, cannibalize the assets, and hide behind the facade of familial duty to mask his embezzlement. Therefore, Theodore had crafted a hidden, deeply buried failsafe, a secret provision woven into the bedrock of the true trust, designed specifically to detonate the moment William's corruption threatened the family name. Caldwell traced his finger along the aged ink, reading the fateful hidden clause aloud. The words were a ghost speaking directly from the grave of final unanswerable judgment. The trust was never intended to reward mere biological succession. It was not a prize for producing an heir. Instead, Theodore had secretly stipulated that the entirety of the foundational wealth, the controlling voting shares, and the absolute authority over the asset management empire would automatically and irrevocably transfer to the single descendant who could prove transparent financial stewardship and protect the family legacy from internal ruin. The specific phrasing hung in the freezing air of the boardroom. Protect the family legacy from internal ruin. It was an exact, undeniable description of what had transpired over the past 48 hours. William let out a choked, wet gasp. He grasped the arms of his leather chair, his knuckles white, his eyes darting frantically as the inescapable reality of the trap closed around him. He had spent years trying to destroy me, trying to cast me as the unstable, vindictive outcast, completely unaware that his relentless persecution was forging the exact weapon Theodore had designed to execute him. Catherine stared blankly at the polished wood table, her perfectly painted lips parted in a silent scream of absolute financial terror. The realization that her decades of social climbing and ruthless manipulation had culminated in zero leverage practically broke her mind in real time. Beside her, Brittany slumped downward, the arrogant posture she had carried into the room dissolving into a puddle of shock. The realization that there was no secret fortune waiting for her, no magical loophole to restore her shattered vanity, finally extinguished the last spark of her delusion. Caldwell did not give them a moment to breathe. He turned his attention to Colin, who silently stepped forward and placed 3 massive, heavily bound dossiers onto the table right beside Theodore's original will. The thick stacks of paper landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Caldwell placed his hand flat against the covers of the files. He announced to the terrified board members that these documents were the comprehensive, flawless forensic audit reports that had triggered the federal raid the night before. He explained that these files meticulously detailed every single stolen dollar, every illegal wire transfer, and every offshore ghost account William had constructed over his tenure. Caldwell looked directly at me, his expression softening into one of profound professional respect. He turned back to the room and formally declared that my actions did not represent a betrayal of the family name, but rather its ultimate salvation. By single-handedly uncovering the syndicate's stolen funds, engineering the federal intervention, and exposing William's catastrophic fraud, I had executed a flawless demonstration of transparent financial stewardship. I had surgically excised the cancer threatening to consume the corporation. Therefore, Caldwell proclaimed I had flawlessly and undeniably fulfilled the exact legal requirement stipulated by grandfather Theodore's hidden clause. The legal transfer of power required no further debate, no board approval, and no shareholder vote. The mechanism was automatic and absolute. Caldwell slammed the thick leather cover of his portfolio shut, the sound ringing out like a judge's gavel. He announced that as of this exact second, I was officially recognized as the sole controlling entity of the entire family trust. I had absolute authority over the corporation, the foundational assets, and the fate of every executive sitting in that room. The remaining board members stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, instantly recognizing that the regime of William and Catherine was permanently dead. I stood tall at the head of the table, looking down at the broken, trembling figures of my parents and sister, officially taking total, uncompromising control of the empire they had tried to steal. The absolute finality of Elias Caldwell's declaration still hung heavy in the boardroom air when the heavy double doors were breached for a second time. The disruption was not a quiet, dignified legal maneuver. It was a tactical, overwhelming intrusion. Detective Ramirez strode into the executive suite, bypassing the stunned reception staff outside, flanked by a half-dozen uniformed police officers and federal agents. Their sudden presence instantly shattered whatever fragile, lingering silence remained in the wake of my ascension to the head of the trust. The air cracked with the sharp metallic sounds of utility belts and heavy boots against the plush carpeting. Ramirez did not pause to address the board members or offer pleasantries. He marched directly toward the far end of the table where William and Catherine remained frozen in their seats. He held up a thick sheaf of official documents, the stark black text of federal wire fraud warrants glaring under the bright recessed lighting. His voice cut through the room with practiced, authoritative lethality. He announced that William and Catherine were being formally charged with multiple counts of systemic wire fraud, international money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. The raid at the gala had merely been the seizure of their physical assets and the serving of civil indictments. This morning, however, was the execution of their criminal arrest warrants. The reality of imminent federal prison time crashed down upon the family like a collapsing skyscraper. William let out a guttural wheezing sound, clutching his chest as two agents flanked his chair and ordered him to stand. Catherine shrank back, her eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. But the most visceral reaction did not come from my parents. It came from Brittany. Throughout the legal slaughter, Brittany had remained slumped in her chair, paralyzed by the loss of her promised fortune. But the sight of federal agents pulling out steel handcuffs and the mention of criminal conspiracy triggered a primal, vicious instinct for self-preservation. She knew her fingerprints were all over the smear campaign, the fraudulent tabloid payments, and the orchestrated defamation that had propped up their failing empire. She realized with blinding clarity that she was directly implicated in their criminal web. In an instant, the loyal, pampered daughter completely vanished. Brittany shot up from her leather chair with such force that it toppled backward, crashing loudly against the glass wall. She scrambled away from her mother, physically putting distance between herself and the sinking ship. With her hands shaking violently, Brittany dug into her designer handbag and produced her smartphone. She practically lunged at Detective Ramirez, shoving the device toward his chest. Her voice was shrill, echoing with manic desperation, as she loudly and publicly turned on the woman who had spent 30 years orchestrating her golden life. She screamed that she had nothing to do with the corporate embezzlement. She pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at Catherine, declaring that her mother was the mastermind behind every vicious scheme. Brittany unlocked her phone and frantically tapped the screen, insisting that Ramirez look at the encrypted text messages and deleted email logs she had secretly backed up. She openly confessed to the entire room that her pregnancy had been completely faked, a desperate ploy engineered solely by Catherine to manipulate Jamal and force a lucrative marriage. She babbled hysterically about the burner accounts, the cash payments to gossip bloggers, and the coordinated social media attacks against me, shrieking that Catherine had forced her into participating under the threat of cutting off her allowance. She threw her mother entirely to the wolves, begging the federal agents for immunity in exchange for her full, unredacted cooperation. The boardroom watched in horrified fascination. I stood beside Caldwell, maintaining a cold, unyielding exterior, as the final pillar of Catherine's entire existence violently crumbled. Catherine did not fight the agents as they pulled her to her feet. The fight had been entirely ripped out of her. She stared at Brittany, her eyes wide, glassy, and pooling with devastated tears. The loss of her wealth, her social standing, and her freedom paled in comparison to the absolute soul-crushing betrayal of her golden child. Catherine had sacrificed everything, including her own morality and her relationship with her middle daughter, to elevate Brittany to the pinnacle of society. She had lied, cheated, and destroyed lives to ensure Brittany's success. And now, facing the abyss, the daughter she had worshipped was eagerly feeding her to the authorities to save her own skin. A low, agonizing sob tore from Catherine's throat. It was the sound of a woman whose entire universe had just been proven utterly hollow. She reached a trembling hand out toward Brittany, a pathetic, wordless plea for loyalty. Brittany actively recoiled, shielding her face and shouting at the officers to keep Catherine away from her. Detective Ramirez secured Brittany's phone in an evidence bag with a curt nod, assigning an officer to formally process her statement. He then turned his attention back to my parents. The harsh, definitive click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around William's wrists echoed loudly in the cavernous room. A second later, the same metallic snap secured Catherine. They were read their Miranda rights in a steady, monotonous drone that finalized their destruction. The agents marched them out of the boardroom, a brutal, humiliating procession, past the staring eyes of the executives they had once tyrannized. William stumbled, his head bowed, his arrogant posture permanently broken. Catherine wept silently, her gaze fixed on the floor, leaving behind a legacy of absolute ruin. Brittany stood panting near the corner of the room, clutching her chest, and looking around with a wild, triumphant glimmer in her eyes, mistakenly believing she had successfully navigated her way out of the wreckage. She turned toward me, a tentative, manipulative smile beginning to form, as if expecting me to applaud her treacherous survival skills. Elias Caldwell stepped forward, cutting off her delusion with a single freezing glare. He addressed her with clinical detachment, explaining the harsh reality of her new existence. Her cooperation with the authorities might save her from a federal prison cell, but it offered zero protection from her financial reality. He formally notified her that as the newly minted sole executor of the trust, I had already initiated the immediate freezing of all her accounts, credit lines, and secondary trust funds. She was entirely stripped of her assets, cut off from the family fortune, and left utterly bankrupt. Furthermore, Caldwell produced a crisp, heavily stamped legal document from his portfolio. He handed it to the remaining police officer standing near the door, instructing him to formally serve Brittany. It was an ironclad permanent restraining order filed on behalf of Jamal, and fully supported by her own frantic confessions of harassment and manipulation. She was legally barred from ever contacting him, approaching his properties, or attempting any further interference in his life. Brittany stared at the restraining order, her manic energy rapidly draining away into a hollow, gaping void. She had betrayed her parents, forfeited her wealth, and permanently lost the man she had obsessed over. She had nothing left. The officers coldly directed her to leave the premises, escorting her out of the glass doors. She walked out of the corporate headquarters alone, destitute, and completely abandoned, stepping into a world where her manufactured charm possessed absolutely no currency. 5 months slipped by with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life finally swept clean of poison. The biting winter winds that had battered the glass of the Sterling Foundation Gala had surrendered to the vibrant warmth of a Chicago spring. The harsh glare of corporate boardrooms and the cold intimidation of federal indictments were replaced by something entirely different. I blinked against the golden late afternoon sunlight pouring through the expansive windows of my private maternity suite at Northwestern Memorial. The city skyline stretched out before me, an endless landscape of glass and steel, catching the fiery hues of the setting sun. For the first time in my life, I was not looking at it through the lens of a battlefield. I shifted against the crisp pillows, a bone-deep exhaustion settling into my muscles, entirely eclipsed by a wave of absolute, unadulterated triumph. Resting securely against my chest, wrapped in a soft receiving blanket, was my newborn son. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair and lungs, powerful enough to announce his arrival to the entire maternal ward just an hour prior. The sheer reality of his weight in my arms completely obliterated the manipulative shadows of the past. There were no calculated schemes here, no fake ultrasound printouts, bought with blackmail money, and no desperate plays for a toxic inheritance. There was only life pure, unfiltered, and entirely mine. Colin sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his large hand gently cradling the back of our son's tiny head. The fierce, lethal vigilance that had been his permanent armor during our war against my family had melted away. In its place was an expression of such profound reverence that it made my chest ache. He had not let go of my hand through the entire grueling labor, a silent, immovable pillar of strength. He leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead, murmuring quiet promises of protection and love, grounded in action, not empty rhetoric. We had fought through the fire together, and this breathing reality was our ultimate reward. A soft knock at the solid oak door broke the quiet intimacy of the room. The door swung open to reveal Jamal holding an obscenely large bouquet of blue hydrangeas, his face split into a grin so wide it threatened to break his jaw. Right beside him, radiating undeniable warmth, was Beatrice. The formidable syndicate matriarch had traded her usual razor-sharp designer suits for a soft cashmere cardigan. The chilling authority she had wielded to command the ballroom 5 months ago was gone, replaced by the eager, unmasked joy of an expectant grandmother. Jamal stepped into the room with a buoyant, weightless energy. The heavy, suffocating dread that had shadowed his every movement during his entanglement with my sister had vanished completely. He was free, his professional and personal life scrubbed clean of the parasites that had tried to drain him. He approached the bed with careful steps, peering down at the sleeping infant with a mixture of awe and delight. He immediately declared himself the undisputed favorite uncle, boasting about the ridiculous oversized teddy bear waiting out in the hallway that the nurses had deemed a fire hazard. Beatrice moved to the other side of the bed, her sharp eyes softening as she reached out to gently brush her knuckles against the baby's incredibly soft cheek. She did not speak of Trust's corporate assets or the messy federal trials currently dominating the evening news cycles. She simply looked at me with a profound, quiet respect. She had seen me navigate the treacherous waters of corporate betrayal and familial warfare, and she had stood right beside me. We had forged a bond in the crucible of that boardroom, a connection built on absolute transparency and unyielding trust. I looked around the sunlit suite, letting the easy, melodic sounds of their laughter wash over me. Colin was playfully arguing with Jamal over the baby's future sports allegiances, while Beatrice comfortably critiqued the hospital's attempt at brewing decent tea. I absorbed the scene, a profound realization settling over my soul like a warm, heavy blanket. For 30 years, I had been force-fed a toxic, manipulative definition of family. I had been taught that bloodlines were absolute chains, requiring endless sacrifice, silent suffering, and the complete subjugation of my own identity to maintain a flawless public facade. I had been conditioned to believe that loyalty meant setting myself on fire just to keep my abusers warm. Sitting here surrounded by these three incredible people, I knew the absolute truth. True family is never defined by a shared surname or the accidental genetics of birth. It is not an obligation you are born into, nor is it a debt you are forced to endlessly repay. True family is an active daily choice. It is comprised entirely of the people who do not flinch when your world catches fire. It is the people who stand fiercely and immovably by your side when the lights go out, the ones who willingly step into the dark to help you find your way back to the surface. I turned my gaze back toward the expansive glass window. The Chicago skyline was now glittering with a million tiny artificial stars against the deepening twilight. Out there in some cold, isolated federal facility, William and Catherine were facing the absolute ruin they had meticulously engineered for themselves. Somewhere else, Brittany was learning the harsh, unforgiving reality of a world that did not care about her manufactured charm or empty bank accounts. They were ghosts, entirely banished from my narrative, their toxic influence permanently excised from my timeline. I pulled my son a fraction closer, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of his tiny heart against my own. I had stripped away the poison, dismantled the empire of lies, and reclaimed the foundational assets that were rightfully mine. But the money, the corporate control, and the public vindication were simply the mechanics of my survival. The true ultimate payoff was right here in this room. I had built a fortress of genuine love, absolute trust, and unwavering loyalty. I had finally found my real family. Looking down at the beautiful, peaceful face of my newborn boy, I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that our legacy was finally safe. The most powerful lesson from Maddie's journey is that family is never defined by the toxic obligations of a shared bloodline, but by mutual respect and unwavering support. For years, Maddie endured manipulation under the guise of familial duty. Her ultimate triumph wasn't merely dismantling her parents' fraudulent empire, it was breaking free from their cycle of conditional love. By surrounding herself with a found family who stood fiercely by her during her darkest hours, she proved that true loyalty is earned, never blindly owed. Share your own experiences of walking away from toxic relationships to find your true tribe in the comments below.